The next item of business is a statement by Alex Salmond on the Scottish Government's programme. The First Minister's statement will be followed by a debate, and there should therefore be no interventions or interruptions. I call on Alex Salmond, First Minister.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The programme I am about to outline is a programme of a government which is ambitious for Scotland. We are using our current powers to the full to help businesses and families, and we are committed to expanding this Parliament's powers so we can take full responsibility for creating a welfare and fairer nation. In the autumn of 2014, people in Scotland will choose whether they want this nation to be independent. In my view, one of the best arguments for independence is that this national parliament, as its record shows, is the one which is best placed to share their values, reflect their priorities, and therefore to legislate in their best interests. That is the core of the argument that I will make this afternoon and the programme which I will announce. I want to start by focusing on jobs and growth, both because they are our top priority and because economic policy shows so clearly the constraints of Scotland's current constitutional position. The figures show that the Scottish Government is doing all that we can to support jobs in these tough economic times. The latest labour market statistics show that Scotland is leading the UK on all three headline labour market indicators. Our unemployment and economic inactivity rates are lower, and our employment rate is higher than the UK average. The figures also suggest that the decline in economic output has been significantly smaller in Scotland than in the rest of the UK, 0.2% over 6 months here compared to 0.7% across the UK for the last period in which there is comparable data. However, the very fact that there has been a contraction in output underlines the need for urgent action. Any plan to support growth at the present time must focus on immediate public sector capital investment. The construction sector is suffering most at present. Now, sometimes in this chamber, people claim that capital budgets available to the Scottish Government, available to this Parliament, have been increased. But these are only adjustments to the plans first set out by Alistair Darling, who we will remember promised cuts that were deeper and tougher than those of Margaret Thatcher. In real terms, the capital budget of the Scottish Government today is 30% lower than it was in 2009. Let me repeat that, 30% lower in real terms than it was in 2009. Now, I've written 5 times now asking the Prime Minister to provide additional funding for shovel-ready capital projects across the country. These are projects which could improve our long-term productivity while helping to promote economic recovery now. No extra funding has been forthcoming, despite the fact that the first letter to the Prime Minister in March was written at his specific request. Now, the weekend papers seem to suggest something of a rethink by the coalition about the importance of capital spending. So let me repeat now, whatever plans are for the future, whatever infrastructure may or may not be built, the minimum required right now, this year, is £5 billion for the UK and £400 million for Scotland. There has never been an economic recovery without a recovery in the construction sector. Now, in the absence of this additional funding, we've had to bring forward as much capital spending as our current powers allow. In 2008-9, 2009-10, we brought forward more than £300 million supporting 5,000 jobs. This year in June, John Swinney announced he was implementing a £105 million capital spending package. Over this year and the next 2, we will switch over £700 million of spending from resource to capital and capital receipts. In addition, our £2.5 billion non-profit distribution investment pipeline now has 4 major projects in procurement, including new colleges for Inverness, for Glasgow and Kilmarnock, as well as the improvements to the Central Scotland motorway network. This focus on capital investment, this urgent focus, is part of a wider programme of support for businesses and economic growth. We have maintained the most competitive business taxation environment anywhere in the UK. 60% of business premises, more than 120,000 business premises, receive relief on business rates. Our enterprise agencies have been notably effective. Last year, more than 7,000 planned jobs were attracted here, together with almost £350 million of investment. Ernst & Young's latest business attractiveness survey shows that Scotland is the #1 ranked part of these islands, comfortably ahead of even London, for attracting jobs through inward investment. The enterprise agencies are also helping Scottish companies to market themselves overseas. Food and drink exports increased by almost 20% last year to a record £5.4 billion. And our low-carbon sector continues to go from strength to strength. The renewable energy industry now employs 11,000 people and has seen £2.8 billion of investment since 2008. The Institute of Public Policy Research report, published last weekend, showed unequivocally the importance of wind power in providing a stable, secure and economic source of renewable energy. Wave and tidal power will join it. Scotland has massive resources in all three. In the last fortnight in Thurso and Renfrew, I've met young engineering trainees and apprentices being equipped with the skills they need for the jobs of the future. In communities that length and breadth for the country, from Machrihanish and Argyll to Methil and Fife, from Ede and Orkney to the Forth Tay and the Clyde, the renewable energy revolution is beginning. And with it, we are seeing the prospect of the reindustrialisation of Scotland. Tomorrow there will be a ministerial visit to Ravenscraig, on the site which is emblematic of Scotland's deindustrialisation in the 1980s and 90s. A further part of our low-carbon future is taking shape. BRE is developing a housing innovation showcase at Ravenscraig for the technologies which will be crucial to our housing sector and the low-carbon economy in the decades to come. Ravenscraig regeneration is further evidence of our determination that all the communities in Scotland, including those most affected by industrial decline, will benefit from a low-carbon future. We're also promoting the economics of security and equity, recognising that confidence among ordinary households, the confidence to plan and spend, is central to any lasting economic recovery. We have helped to sustain demand by protecting household budgets in tough times, through policies such as free education, prescriptions, concessionary travel and frozen council tax bills. We have promoted a social wage for ordinary households. But while we have done that, the UK Government's last budget proposed antisocial tax cuts for a minority. One half of the coalition now wants to reverse that policy, safe in the knowledge that the other half won't let them. That's what passes for joined-up government at Westminster. We promote a living wage to support economic justice. We have a policy of no compulsory redundancies in the Scottish Government and the Health Service. This doesn't mean that there won't be a reduction in numbers, but it does give people more security in planning for the future. That focus on growth will continue in the next parliamentary year. It is at the very heart of many of the bills that we will introduce. The budget bill will protect capital spending as far as is possible. It will prioritise resources to support our core purpose, promoting opportunities for all through sustainable economic growth. In addition to the draft budget, a progress report on the Government Economic Strategy will be published in the next few weeks. Our bankruptcy bill will modernise bankruptcy laws, ensuring they are fair for both creditors and debtors. We'll introduce two bills, the Land and Buildings Transaction Tax Bill and the Landfill Tax Bill, to set out how these taxes will operate and to ensure they meet Scotland's needs once this Parliament assumes responsibility for them in 2015. The Better Regulation Bill will protect our people and our environment while helping businesses to flourish and create jobs. It is essential at any time, but especially in tough times, that public sector procurement, which is worth more than £9 billion annually, brings the maximum possible public benefit. Already 45% of the value of Scotland's current procurement spending goes to small and medium-sized businesses. More than 75% of the contracts awarded by Public Contracts Scotland last year went to companies based in Scotland. The Procurement Reform Bill will build on that record. It will ensure that the community benefit clauses are included in all new major public sector contracts, and those receiving such contracts make binding commitments to training and to apprenticeships. As part of that emphasis on managing public sector spending effectively, the Fourth Estuary Transport Authority Bill will enable us to adopt the most cost-effective approach to managing and maintaining the existing Forth Road Bridge and the new replacement crossing. That new crossing is Scotland's biggest engineering project in a generation. It already directly employs 1,100 people, and many more people are now employed in the 300 Scottish firms who are now working on the contracting and supply chain for that project. Now, that record demonstrates that this Parliament is exercising its current economic powers wisely. However, without full responsibility for the economy, we will continue to be constrained by the choices, frequently at present disastrous choices, being made by Westminster. With independence, we'd have the fiscal powers needed to bring forward capital spending, promote growth sectors of the economy, encourage even more businesses to invest or start up in Scotland. We'd also be able to take advantage of Scotland's comparatively strong financial position. In the 5 years to 2010-11, the most recent GERS figures, Scotland was in a relatively stronger current budget position than the UK as a whole, to the tune of £8.6 billion. £1,600 per person, including by £2.7 billion or £500 per person in 2010-11. In other words, if we were an independent country, these resources over that period could have been applied to either increase spending, reduce taxation, bear down on borrowing, invest in an oil fund, or indeed any combination of these options. Without access to our own resources, Scotland can do none of these things. That is the point and purpose of the economic choices which independence offers. It's also one reason, just one, but a very important one, that we are introducing a referendum bill in this parliamentary year. We believe that only with independence can we have the powers we need to promote jobs and growth. Earlier this year, the Government issued a consultation paper on our proposals for running and regulating the referendum. This sparked a huge response, with over 26,000 replies. These are being analysed by independent researchers, and we will publish the report next month. I expect to meet the Prime Minister in the next few weeks to conclude the discussions which our respective ministers have been having over this summer. However, the fact that the response rate to the Scottish Government consultation paper was almost 10 times that of the UK Government's own consultation, which was not subject to any independent analysis, that point underlines a very significant feature. The people of Scotland recognise that Scotland's referendum should be made here in Scotland. Presiding Officer, I believe that independence is crucial to creating a fairer Scotland as well as a wealthier one. In this programme for government, we are continuing to invest in human capital as well as our physical capital. The Government's Opportunities for All initiative has no parallel anywhere else in these islands, guaranteeing a training opportunity to any young person between 16 and 19 who is not in education, employment or training. During 2011-12, we delivered more than 26,000 modern apprenticeships, every single one of which is linked to a real employment opportunity. The completion rate increased again to a record 75%. We now have 56% of our youngsters employed compared to a UK average of 50%. We have retained the vital educational maintenance allowances when the UK Government chose to abolish them. In the last few days, it has become clear that we have a record number of Scottish students at Scottish universities for the coming year, compared to the 25,000 decline in English students able to go to English universities. There's also been an increase in English and international students coming to Scottish universities, all of which is excellent news for the sector and excellent news for Scotland, and a complete vindication of this government's policy of re-establishing free education. So our post-16 Education Reform Bill will develop a system of education and training which meets the needs of learners and employers and which helps to drive jobs and growth. Among other measures, it will support college regionalisation, aided by an investment programme which has already transformed Dundee, Aberdeen, Banff and Buchan, Thurso, Langside and Forth Valley colleges. It will provide for outcome agreements with our universities as the basis for widening access to all sections of the community. But we know we need to do more. We've invested £30 million additional to support youth employment in the last year and have appointed Angela Constance as the first dedicated Minister for Youth Employment anywhere in these islands. Next week, in partnership with the Scottish Trade Union Congress and others, we will hold a key summit on women's employment to explore and address specific concerns on that issue. Our commitment to fairness is also shown in our support for core public services, such as the National Health Service. A Nottingham University report has recently said the management of health service reform in Scotland, with its emphasis on partnership working, quote, should serve as a role model for the public sector across the UK. Our Adult Health and Social Care Integration Bill maintains that emphasis on partnership and collaboration. It will establish the joint accountability of health boards and councils for the delivery of adult health and social care. We will also introduce 3 significant pieces of legislation to improve the effectiveness of our justice system. The Tribunals Bill will establish a simpler system of tribunals, including a new system for appeals. The Victims and Witnesses Bill will place victims' interests at the heart of improvements to the justice system, for example, by expanding the protection available to vulnerable witnesses. And the Criminal Justice Bill will implement the recommendations of the expert reviews led by Lord Carloway into criminal procedure in general and Sheriff Principal Bowen into sheriff and jury procedure. For example, by simplifying processes for arresting and questioning suspects, providing greater protections for vulnerable and child suspects. We are consulting on how to implement Lord Carloway's recommendation to remove the requirement for corroboration in criminal trials. Lord Carloway is a very distinguished judge and, of course, the new Lord Justice Clerk of Scotland. The idea that he is operating in anything other than the best interests of Scots law is ridiculous. In promoting a fairer Scotland, we will legislate for equal rights. Our Marriage and Civil Partnership Bill will enable same-sex couples to get married and will allow civil partnerships to be registered through a religious ceremony. The bill will be subject to a conscience vote in this Parliament, certainly among SNP MSPs. It will strike a balance. It will establish the right of same-sex couples to be recognised by the law in the same way as all other married couples. It will also ensure that no church, faith group or indeed individual celebrant will be required to take part in a same-sex marriage ceremony unless they wish to do so. In addition, freedom of speech and conscience will be rigorously upheld. In my view, this is the appropriate way to respect religious and private beliefs while ensuring equality of treatment before the law. Deputy Presiding Officer, the emphasis on growth and on fairness is based on a desire to allow everyone in Scotland to flourish. To achieve this, one of the major aims of the Scottish Government is a huge switch towards preventative spending. In partnership with local government, we have made more than £500 million available to 3 change funds to support early years initiatives, adult social care and to tackle reoffending. We know that if we can care for adults who need it, if we can reduce reoffending then rather than simply dealing with its consequences, and particularly if we can give people the best possible start in life, then we will strengthen our communities, improve the well-being of our people and make long-term savings. Focusing on children's early years is the most fundamental and effective form of intervention to address poor health, underemployment and harm. It is one of the very best investments that any government in any country or any society can ever make. It has the objective of offering each child an equal chance. Today I can announce we are allocating £18 million from the Early Years Change Fund to create high-quality, coordinated, accessible family support. I saw the difference that such support can make when I visited Dr Bell's Family Centre in Leith this morning. This funding can make it more widely accessible. And although that we have to face as a Parliament and society that the impact of the coming welfare changes from Westminster are going to bear down on hundreds of thousands of people in Scotland, these initiatives which I have outlined, good things to do at any time, are going to be essential in the coming time. In addition, in this parliamentary year, we'll introduce a Children and Young People Bill. That bill will enshrine in law the commitment to all 3- and 4-year-olds, all looked after 2-year-olds, should receive a minimum of 600 hours of early learning and childcare, rather than the current minimum of 475 hours, or the 412 hours that we inherited from the previous administration. It will place key parts of the getting it right for every child approach in law. It will promote stable and permanent home environments for children, for example, by establishing new rights for kinship carers. And for families across Scotland, it will deliver the best package of early learning and childcare support anywhere across the UK, helping parents, especially women, into work, as well as promoting the well-being of children and families. The bill demonstrates our wider aspirations for the next generation. Better early learning and childcare to promote the independence of parents and families. Free education to protect the financial independence of our young people. An adult care and social wage to support the independence and dignity of older Scots. Job promotion to enable the economic independence of individuals. But as well as supporting the independence of families and individuals, we need independence for Scotland, the nation. Presiding Officer, over the last decade, in my estimation, the Scottish Parliament has achieved much. Land reform, the ban on smoking in public places, world-leading climate change legislation. I also believe that some of the legislation in the last parliamentary year, especially on anti-sectarianism and minimum pricing for alcohol, will come to be seen in the same way as bold legislation which changed Scotland permanently and for the better. The contrast between the record of this Parliament and that of Westminster is striking. Under the United Kingdom government, entrants to English universities are down this year by 25,000. In Scotland, admissions of Scottish students to Scottish universities are at record levels. Under the United Kingdom government, the National Health Service in England is being dismantled. In Scotland, under our integrated health service, more than 90% of patients are treated within 18 weeks of referral by a general practitioner. Under the UK government, the Home Secretary responsible for falling police numbers had to address the Police Federation in front of a banner which called her cuts criminal. In Scotland, Kenny McCaskill, responsible for rising police numbers and record low levels of recorded crime, received a standing ovation from the Scottish Police Federation. No sane person in this Parliament or elsewhere would want powers over universities, our health service or our police to be returned to Westminster. But if, as Deputy Presiding Officer, we can manage those services more effectively than the UK government, why shouldn't we also have control over pensions, control over welfare, and our own voice in the world? Earlier this year, I suggested independent Scotland could be a beacon for progressive opinion for the rest of the United Kingdom. The record of achievement of this Parliament demonstrates that potential. This legislative programme of 15 bills will add to that record. It will lead to the best childcare provision anywhere in the United Kingdom. It uses all of the powers that we currently have to promote jobs, growth and opportunities for all. And it paves the way for Scotland's most important decision in 300 years. It is therefore a historic package of measures. The record of this Parliament is the clearest possible evidence that the best people to take decisions about the future of Scotland are the people who choose to live and work in our country. We will give them the choice of independence, responsibility for ourselves as a nation, a voice in the world, and a government that reflects the people's priorities and Scottish values. Presiding Officer, I commend our programme for government to this Parliament and to the people.
Thank you, First Minister. That ends the statement on the programme for government, and we turn to the next item of business, which is a debate on the Scottish Government's programme. Can I invite all of those members who wish to speak in the debate to press the request to speak buttons now, please, and I call on Joanne Lamont to open the debate. 18 minutes.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. There's always one thing we can say about the First Minister: he is never knowingly undersold. But what we have also learned, is of the importance of going behind the assertion and looking at the detail and the reality of what his government is actually doing. It really is not enough for the First Minister to display so little self-awareness that he says, we do wonderful things in the economy, we are committed to using procurement, we believe in the construction industry, and then spend £700 million bolstering the economies of Spain, Poland and China. But of course, Presiding Officer, this is a programme of few surprises, bar one major one. There is nothing in it actually to address the problems which families the length and breadth of Scotland are facing. There is much, of course, we can agree on, in much the same way as a magnolia paint chart fails to engender much opposition. But a radical government, radically conservative in its ambitions for changing people's lives for the better, radical only in Alex Salmond's ambition to change his title from First Minister to Prime Minister. Now, since last May, the First Minister has lauded his landslide result over us. Let me tell him about landslides. Labour landslide in 1945, the creation of the NHS. Labour landslide in 1997, the creation of this Parliament. SNP landslide in 2011, a referendum he really doesn't want to hold. And a country put on pause while the First Minister dithers. Radical, reforming. Unless you think in 50 years' time people are going to be waxing lyrical about the Great Salmon better regulation reforms of 2012. I think not. What a wasted opportunity. There he is, the First Minister with an overall majority. What an opportunity to change Scotland for a generation, radically to overhaul education, to set our NHS on a new footing. And if he's been prepared to be radical, we'd have been prepared to work with him. But when it comes to the big issues, well, let me go back. We've been prepared to work with him, as indeed we offered to work with him on the referendum question, and he has stoically since refused to meet with us. But when it comes to the big issues which actually affect people's lives, the poverty of his ambition borders on destitution. Here is a man who glories in his own powerlessness. He says he can't change Scotland because he doesn't have enough power. So he doesn't use the power he has to change Scotland for the better.
Kevin Stewart.
While we're talking about radicalism, would it not be a bit radical for the Labour Party to actually spell out what extra powers they want for this Parliament? Or are they quite happy for the Tory-Liberal coalition to decimate this country?
Joanne Lamont, I can assure you that our commitment is to make devolution work, not to break the United Kingdom up. By the Scottish Government's own figures, every family in Scotland is worse off by £1,200 a year. So what do we have here to protect families? Nothing. When asked about Tory cuts, the First Minister acts like a second-rate presenter of a daytime cookery show, pausing only to open up an oven and present us with another cut that George Osborne prepared earlier. Now, speaking of the Tories, when we see this tired, jaded set of priorities, the best that the First Minister's front bench can come up with after 5 years in government, perhaps David Cameron isn't the only one who should be looking at a reshuffle. Maybe he should be looking for some hungry backbencher to take over the NHS before nursing numbers fall even further. Perhaps Mike Russell should be shown the door and replaced by someone not intent doing more damage to our colleges. And maybe Alec Neil should look elsewhere so that someone who is prepared to tackle fuel poverty can take his place. This legislative programme is a mixture of the late and the far too late. 5 years on, there is the First Minister's unnecessary bill to provide the childcare which he promised 5 years ago at some point after 2014. He could deliver that promise with a stroke of a pen. Instead, there are parents who voted for that in 2007 whose children will be at secondary school before it's delivered. Mind you, they'll probably be at university before the curriculum for excellence comes in. And as I said, a year after he gave a kickstart to the Chinese, Polish and Spanish economies with a £700 million Forth Road Bridge contract, he decides we need to look at the rules in procurement. Too little, too late. Now, don't get me wrong, there are things in this programme which can be commended. The problem is, it's good to be back amongst SNP backbenchers who make Pavlov's dog look joyously spontaneous in comparison. But the problem with the programme is like a 1970s ladder. It's fine as far as it goes. If only the First Minister had the ambition of Falkirk Council. There, the Labour-led administration ensures that council contracts include training or employment for local young people. Unlike Labour in Wales, unlike Labour in Falkirk, this government has so far refused to prioritise the use of community benefit clauses to benefit the country. And if he's come round to this way of thinking now, good, we will welcome that. But we will wait until he walks the walk rather than simply talk the talk. Now, the one issue which dominates the thinking of every family in this country is the economy. Hard-working people who fear for their jobs, who worry about how they're going to make ends meet, how they will pay their way and put food on the table. The challenge for the First Minister is to test his policies against how they create jobs and growth in the economy, not how they further his referendum campaign. This programme fails to ask the right questions, let alone provide any answers. We have a Tory government in Westminster which is deepening and prolonging the recession by cutting too far and too fast. And what is the response? What is the response from this government? What is this response from this government? Well, the fact of the matter is, of course, the First Minister talks about the Westminster government. The problem is it's a Tory government, which he celebrated coming in when he said he wanted to see the end of a Labour government. He was the man who argued for people not to support Labour at the last election, and that was the consequence. They have nothing new to say, and they haven't even kept to what they promised they would do. The First Minister took time out last session to attend the premiere of Brave. This session, I hope he takes time out actually to be brave for Scotland. The First Minister says there has never been an economic recovery without a recovery in the construction sector. Yep. So why did he slash the housing budget? Yep. Why? Consistently over time, has he either ended infrastructure projects like Garrel or had an unconscionable delay in bringing them forward? The SNP promised to deliver 100,000 training opportunities each year for young Scots. However, Mr Salmon's fine words on youth unemployment will be of little consolation to young Scots on the dole queue. The Scottish Government's latest figures for 16 to 24-year-olds show that the youth unemployment rate in Scotland increased over the year. Over 1 in 5 16 to 24-year-olds are now unemployed. The SNP's promise of 25,000 modern apprenticeships was nothing more than an exercise in fiddling the figures to mislead the public. More than 10,000 publicly funded apprenticeships supposed to help the unemployed went to people already in work. This is the First Minister who says that the rocks will melt in the sun before he'll introduce tuition fee. And the price for that boast. This man who dares to say that the FE sector will benefit from his policies, we see opportunities for thousands of young Scots melting away as he slashes funding for further education colleges by 20%. Why is the SNP government attacking the funding of our vital further education colleges? Is the First Minister aware that in Fife, 25% of school leavers go to Adam Smith and Carnegie colleges, and a mere 2.5% go to his alma mater, St Andrews University? This is a disgrace, and today's legislative programme has nothing to say to the thousands of young people who will be affected by his draconian cuts. Student debt, not abolished as he promised. Clearing places for Scottish students, sorry, the quota was full. In these circumstances, what is an Alex Salmond promise worth? Not much in education, and even less when it comes to the NHS. He promised to protect the NHS budget, yet the health budget will be slashed by £319 million in real terms, and there are all sorts of additional financial pressures too. There are now fewer staff in the NHS than when he became First Minister. Over 5,500 cut from the payroll, and almost 2,500 of them are nurses. The SNP promised shorter waiting times. Then we heard of NHS Lothian's practice of using so-called social unavailability or offering patients appointments and operations they cannot possibly attend. Cynical manipulation of waiting times under the SNP. Nurse numbers cut to a level lower than when the SNP came to power in 2007. More than 2,000 cuts since 2009. And a growing list of inspections show a deterioration of care standards as nurses and staff struggle to cope with increasing pressure. And all the denial in the world cannot hide these figures and the reality for people in their experience of the NHS. A&E waits worsening, more than 5,000 Scots waiting more than 8 hours for treatment in A&E departments in 2011. And we know the First Minister's record of being in denial even when evidence comes to him of the treatment of patients. These are the problems of Alex Salmond's Scotland, and nothing in this legislative programme does anything to address them. Now, in recent days, the political pages of the press have been filled with stories of a spin doctor moving on and new spin doctors being hired. Funnily, there is never any copy on his head of policy, because the reality is this is a government bereft of policy and bereft of ideas. Full fat slogans, yes. Full fat slogans, yes. But calorie-free policy, definitely. Nothing for jobs, nothing for those in need. Slogans and soundbites with the promise, the threat, you're on your own if you disagree. But reality is beginning to creep in as the spin doctors creep out. The country knows the lived reality of Salmond Scotland behind the spin. Record numbers of drug deaths, up 76% on 2001. No record of successful number of drug addicts completing treatment. No refreshed drugs policy since 2008. We have called on the SNP for a full inquiry into drug treatment policy. Will he now agree to one? And what happens when Alex Salmond does keep a promise? In 2007, the SNP proposed to entitle 3- and 4-year-olds to a minimum of 600 nursery hours a year. 5 years on, still nothing done. Now a bill to do what the First Minister could do in a moment. Why is it taking so long? Because the government is underfunding local authorities, perhaps? Even the now SNP Minister for Children and Young People said in this chamber in 2007, when investing in pre-5 children, we must not waste any more time. What else have they been doing other than waste time and opportunities? A rehashed 2007 policy won't address the childcare problems of 2012. What are the SNP doing about childminding costs, which are higher in Scotland than they are in England? What are the SNP doing about the out-of-school care costs, which are higher in Scotland than they are in England and Wales? And what about wrap-around childcare for children at primary, which makes such a difference to working families? The answer from this bill on all of these is clear: nothing. And on 2-year-olds, this bill does not go far enough either. There are around 60,000 2-year-olds in Scotland, enough to fill Hampden and more. This bill would entitle approximately only 700 looked-after 2-year-olds to nursery provision, just over 1%. In England, even the Tories and Lib Dems are aiming to give 37% of 2-year-olds from the most deprived backgrounds nursery places from next year. The First Minister is planning to entitle just 1%. Is this the progressive beacon he talks about when he lectures in London?
Ms Lamont, can I stop you for a moment, please? There is a bit of time for interventions, which might stop members feeling they have to shout across the chamber. Thank you.
I think we need to allow them to be comfortable with what they enjoy most, rather than thinking and listening to the debate. The truth is, on childcare costs and nursery provision, this is simply not the case. We would like to have seen the Scottish Government bringing forward its Community Empowerment Bill. The possibility of decentralising power into our local communities in stark contrast with a First Minister whose every instinct is to centralise to this place where we all know he has absolute control. This should be an opportunity to build on the progress Labour made on land reform. He will know Scotland still has one of the most concentrated patterns of land ownership in Europe, with vast areas of Scotland still controlled by a tiny number of people. I was informed over the summer that the First Minister has never been to visit a community buyout since taking office, something I had the privilege of when visiting Lewis this summer. These schemes have seen decades of population decline halted, or these schemes have seen decades of population decline halted or even reversed as jobs have been created and more houses built. And I will never apologise to go and visit islands like the Isle of Lewis and those which suggest so much of our heritage that we can be proud of. Because these measures are of economic importance as well as social justice, and they should be at the heart of our economic policy as well as a social policy committed to supporting fragile and remote communities. Perhaps the First Minister will find time to look at the land buyouts, which are revolutionising communities, and look at how he can support these further. Because this is a form of devolution that can make a difference to the lives of real people in real communities and not political parties. And in this year of great triumph for Scottish athletes, which we all hope will be followed with similar success at Glasgow in 2014, Alex Salmond could have announced measures that would improve the provision of sporting opportunities for Scots. He couldn't even do this today. It's symptomatic of the total lack of ambition this administration has for the people of Scotland. Just saying you're ambitious doesn't mean that you are ambitious. Instead, as all too often, the First Minister went for gimmick over substantive policy. First, he announced that a DVD of the film Chariots of Fire will be played to every school child in the autumn term. Not good enough. We need policies to get children onto the playing field, not in front of the television. What we need is a legislative programme which actually addresses Scotland's needs. There is common ground here. We are proud of our record in delivering on equality when we introduced civil partnerships, and Nicola Sturgeon has my support with her equal marriage proposals. I also note that the Children's Bill will contain measures to safeguard vulnerable children, something the First Minister knows will be welcomed on this side of the chamber. The challenge is to ensure these schemes are practical, not theoretical, and actually deliver to protect vulnerable children. And let's ensure that any new measures have the resources to guarantee they can be properly implemented, and we will do all we can to prevent harm coming to those children living with the consequences of addiction in the family home. But the problem with this programme is not what in it, it is what is not in it.
Margaret MacDonald.
Apologise for coming into her peroration. I agree with very much of what Joanne Lamont has said in the last 3 or 4 minutes. The Community Empowerment Bill, for example, buybacks, the introduction of proper measures to stimulate more participation in local sport. Most of these measures, though, don't cost a great deal of money. The difference between those measures and the measures that she criticised as introduced by the government is the amount of money involved. And there's not enough money, and you've got to look to see why that is the reason.
Joanne Lamont.
There is, if the Government comes forward with proposals increasing participation of our young people, I will happily support them. And I say that as a mother who was at the swimming pool at 5 o'clock this morning with my own son. We know how difficult it is for young people to participate, particularly those who do not have parents who can take them. And if the Government is going to come forward with these proposals to be more inclusive in relation to sport, I can assure you I will support them all the way. But as I've said, the problem with this programme is that there's what is not in it. Not one measure which will create a job in Scotland, nothing to promote investment, nothing to defend Scotland from Tory cuts. And let me tell the First Minister, just saying it doesn't make it so. I have to emphasise again. And let me tell the First Minister another bill I welcome, his referendum bill. Let's pass it as quickly as possible. But be clear, the First Minister has a mandate to ask the question the people of this country are entitled to answer, decide once and for all whether they want to stay inside United Kingdom or not. So let's have a single question referendum on whether we're not to stay in United Kingdom as soon as possible. The First Minister talks about negotiating with UK Government ministers. Talk to the parties here about how we can ensure we have a referendum that's not a fix, that has got conditions that are reasonable for any democratic country.
Can I ask you to come to a conclusion?
The First Minister's dithering and distraction. Then we can focus on Scotland's real priorities, on how we create jobs and growth, how we fund world-class public services in a time of scarcity, how we make Scotland a just and prosperous land. I may disagree with Alex Salmond on the Constitution. That can be an honourable disagreement. What depresses me is that he will not use the powers he already has to help Scotland now, today. This legislative programme might be a nationalist one, but it's not one of a patriot who cares about Scotland's needs.
Thank you. I now call on Ruth Davison. 8 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. First day of term and already the First Minister is getting a row from the teacher. But let's have a look at how he spent his summer, shall we? Went to the golf, went to the tennis, went to the book festival, enjoyed some fizz at the TV festival, hoovered up the canapes at the Brave premiere, brought his own vol au vents and put on his own party at the Olympics, the Skillimpics, and spent as much time rushing towards the buffet table as avoiding the negotiating table. It would also appear he spent even less time at his desk doing the job that he was elected to do, which is to run a Scottish Government with competencies over health, education, justice, transport and finance. There's no doubt, Deputy Presiding Officer, that the number of bills announced by the First Minister today will occupy the time of this Parliament over its coming session, or indeed that with an overall majority in the Chamber, ministers will get their way on most, if not all, of these measures. But when the Parliament rises for its recess next summer, it's debatable whether their passage will have made the kind of changes to Scotland that will have benefited the man or woman in the street. On the strength of the bills... Can you let me progress, please? On the strength of the array of bills flagged up today, the answer seems clear. The Scottish Government's approach is never mind the quality, just feel the width. This is a legislative programme that throws into sharp relief the rhetoric of a government which claimed upon its election to stand for the Scottish national interest, but which over the course of the last 12 months has shown itself interested only in promoting the Scottish National Party's interest. The First Minister dresses this up as a legislative programme about the economy, but rather it's a programme dominated by one thing and one thing only: the Scottish Government's obsession of tearing apart the United Kingdom, one which singularly fails to address the most pressing concerns of the Scottish people. I thank the First Minister for advanced sight of his speech, and I should not have been surprised at the bluster, the assertion, the highly selective use of figures that has become the hallmark of this government. But once again, I was. So let's take a look at some of his soft shoe shuffles. There has never been an economic recovery without a recovery in the construction sector. This from a government that has slashed tens of millions of pounds from the housing budget and overseen a slump in the building of new homes to its lowest level in a decade and a half. Next, we will develop a system of education and training which meets the needs of learners and employers. This from a government that is reducing college funding year on year and strong-arming through mergers. I'd be delighted to.
In terms of soft shoe shuffles, Ms Davidson should maybe tell the Chamber that there has been a 30% reduction in capital budgets, and beyond that, that cuts to colleges in England are up to a third.
Ruth Davidson.
Well, let's look at the figures in terms of capital spend, because we've already had the old lie about shovel-ready projects and the demands for infrastructure from Westminster. And we have had no acknowledgement, either from the member or from the front bench or from the First Minister, of the extra £1 billion that has come Scotland's way since the Comprehensive Spending Review of 2010. So on the fantasy figures selected by the First Minister, figures predicated on an oil price already out of date and not in the government's favour, figures that take no account of Scotland's liabilities, for example, the £102 billion worth of pension liabilities, a proportion of the UK national debt, costs from a banking crisis made in Edinburgh, not in the London that he loves to blame.
First Minister.
Gladly give way to the First Minister.
Incidentally, the GERS figures include payments on the national debt, as Ruth Davidson should know. But let's return to the capital investment figures. Alistair Darling planned a 36% reduction in Scotland's capital budget. As a result of the changes that have been made over the last couple of years, that is now a 30% real terms reduction this year compared to 2009. Does Ruth Davidson accept that fact, that the capital budget of the Scottish Government is now 30% lower in real terms than it was in 2009? Yes or no?
Ruth Davidson.
Does the First Minister accept that he's had a £1 billion worth of extra cash from the 2010 spending review? Because he will never admit to it, because it is all about priorities of spending on capital projects. So the selective quoting on figures that we have seen from the First Minister are about one simple thing. They're about bolstering the referendum bill, a referendum bill that provides no answers to Scotland's problems. Quite the contrary. It's a bill that can't even decide on the number of questions. Myself, Joanne Lamont, Willie Rennie, we've tried to help the First Minister. We've commissioned a panel of respected, independent experts to draft a fair, legal and decisive question for this referendum. We've even written to the First Minister about the panel's recommendations and offered to meet to discuss it, to help him to take this matter forward. And what have we got? A flat refusal. Just as his shilly-shallying around talks to thrash out this issue with the UK Government shows his reluctance to take a single, fair question to the people of Scotland. And what of the 26,000 consultation responses promised to us by the end of the summer? Here we are in September and not a peep. His national conversation has turned out, in fact, to be little more than a national monologue. The First Minister speaks, everyone else is just expected to listen. And anyone with a view other than the one he already holds really isn't welcome to take part. But, Deputy Presiding Officer, let's look at the rest of the offering, because I don't want to be wholly negative. I'm not the leader of the Labour Party, after all. I'm pleased to see that the SNP has found room for measures to reform the Freedom of Information Act. And perhaps in future we might even see the Scottish Government accept the rulings of the FOI Commissioner, rather than mount costly appeals to try and block the release of information on whether or not ministers hold legal advice on the status of an independent Scotland within the EU, all at the taxpayer's expense. And on the Equal Marriage Bill, it is an issue which has been debated largely through the media and now will be aired in this chamber. I hope that such an issue, which ignites passions and reveals firmly held views, can be debated freely and in a manner showing courtesy and respect to members from all sides of the debate, demonstrating the Parliament at its best and making sure that the level of debate is elevated and not diminished. It too will be a vote of conscience for MSPs from the Scottish Conservative Party. On the Criminal Justice Bill, Lord Carloway should be commended for his work, but changes to corroboration should be part of a wider review of the law of evidence and not considered in isolation. However, I am surprised by the First Minister's repeated reference to university applications. Only under the SNP can we expect the debacle of Scottish students being turned away from Scottish universities in favour of students from south of the border, because ministers refused to pay attention to the warnings that they were creating a two-tier admission system. And only under the SNP would we be completely unsurprised that, with nobody but themselves to blame, the existence of a problem is simply denied. All of these Scottish students turned away from Scottish universities in favour of students from south of the border must simply have imagined it. I'm sorry, I'm already over my time. It's clear where this First Minister's priorities lie, but they are not the priorities of Scotland's people. Their priority is economic recovery and jobs. Lip service from the First Minister, but a track record telling a different story.
You should be drawing to a close now, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. We have a Scotland-only retail tax pummelling businesses, and now we see with a sucker punch Scotland's property owners with their, being floored with their plans to slash the value of empty property relief and raise business rates on properties up to 80%. This is the legislative programme of a government that has run out of steam, run out of ideas, and which fails to live up to the ambitions of Scotland's people. It is a programme that seeks to create the illusion of activity through a plethora of policies, but which somehow contrives to be somewhat less than the sum of its parts. It is the programme of a government that's been reduced to a simple overriding goal: to break Scotland away from the rest of the United Kingdom. It's not a programme of success for Scotland, but a product of this First Minister's fear of failure.
You must close now, please. Thank you very much. I now call on Willie Rennie, a generous 6 minutes.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Thank you to all the members in this chamber who have expressed their condolences to Astrid Gorry following the sad death of her husband, Donald. Donald was proud to be a member of this Parliament, not for the position itself, but for what he could do, what he could change whilst he was here. He was a model, I think, for all parliamentarians, present and future, and I think we're all sad at his passing. I'm sure Donald would have been a supporter of the government's equal marriage legislation. In fact, in 2005, he said, and I quote, "I thought that the system in this country," typical Donald fashion this, "I thought that the system in this country was that the church did its thing and the state did its thing. It was quite wrong for the state to tell the church what it may or may not do. We should not impose anything on it, nor should we prevent things from happening using blanket provisions." Donald was absolutely spot on. And I think this bill, the government's bill, brings freedom to churches to manage their own affairs, rather than being instructed by government about what they can do and what they can't do. Many want to conduct same-sex marriages, and no government minister, absolutely no government minister, should prevent them from doing so. I think equal marriage will be a mark of a modern, fair and equal society, and I applaud Nicola Sturgeon, I do applaud her, for leading this effort. It won't be easy, but I applaud her for her courage. With scares about brothers marrying, premature death, job losses and the latest polygamy, the more that those opposed to equal marriage protest, the stronger the case becomes. Now, for almost 80 years, you won't like this bit, now for almost 80 years, the SNP have protested about the oppression by the British state. They have marched, advocated, shouted and argued that Scots should be free from the dead hand of Westminster. But now in power, rather than deliver that change, they say they need a little bit longer to sort out the paperwork. 16 months after the SNP won the mandate to hold the referendum, there has been little progress. No publication of the responses to the consultation. No date for negotiations between the Scottish Secretary and the First Minister. Not even a date for that referendum. They spend more time arguing for a second question that they don't support than independence that they apparently do. And now they are redefining independence at a ferocious rate to include more and more of the British state that they have previously demonised. You get the distinct impression that the SNP now fear its own policy. Go on then.
Mark MacDonald.
Perhaps Mr Rennie might like to take this opportunity to put on the record his apology to SCVO and Civic Society for his attempt to shut them out of the debate on Scotland's future.
Willie Rennie.
It was a valiant attempt, but as soon as Martin Symes starts living within the SCVO policy, then I will no longer criticise him. Martin Symes should understand the SCVO do not support a second question, and he knows it, and the First Minister should not misrepresent them. Now, we'll support the Victims Bill that will assist victims with the recovery from crime and give them a greater role in the justice system. Yes,
First Minister Alex Salmond.
If Willie Rennie is correct in his attack, extraordinary attack on Martin Syme, then why did Alison Elliott feel required to write to him to remind him in a free society people like the SCVO should be protected against authoritarian voices like Willie Rennie?
Willie Rennie.
I'm sure the First Minister have read Alison Elliott's speech from earlier on this year, in which she said, "For the avoidance of doubt, we are not launching a campaign for a particular outcome in the referendum. We are not launching a campaign to get a second question on the ballot paper." Now, the First Minister might not like to hear that, but perhaps he will no longer argue that SCVO are arguing for a second question, which they are certainly not. Now, the procurement bill must turn the procurement budget into a tool of economic development, especially for local and small businesses, instead of the big businesses that the current system favours. If the Scottish Government is going to reverse the trend towards bundling contracts to super contracts, then they'll have our support. Now, the Children and Young People Bill will eventually bring Scottish nursery entitlement up to the level already delivered by the coalition in England for 3- and 4-year-olds, but not for the many more disadvantaged 2-year-olds. Now, at the UK level, we have delivered for 40% of the most disadvantaged 2-year-olds. They're going to get a great entitlement to nursery education. I hope the First Minister increases his entitlement for those in Scotland. The big missed opportunity, however, is on Scottish Water. By changing Scottish Water to a public benefit corporation, firmly in the public sector, there is a potential to release £1.5 billion for a windfall. This could be used now. It could be used now for business growth, for energy efficiency, for super-fast broadband, for supporting science and technology research, and also for early intervention. Now, the First Minister has said before that Scottish Water, and I quote, could easily borrow in the markets if it was placed in the same status as Network Rail. So it's incredible that the First Minister is spending on Scottish Water another £140 million that could be invested in his so-called shovel-ready projects. Think of those shovel-ready projects that could be invested if he was bold enough to make that change. But as always,
given
the choice, the SNP would prefer to complain than act. They have ducked away from the single most effective decision for jobs and the economy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We now move to open debate, and I call on Kenneth Gibson, to be followed by Patricia Ferguson, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It is indeed good to be back. And I noticed that the Speaker before last, Ruth Davison, talked about the need to elevate the debate. However, she accused the First Minister of telling a lie and then asserted and made assertions that she was unable to back up regarding capital funding. The Sunday Times editorial on Sunday said the following of the UK Government. It has aggressively cut measures that might improve this country, such as spending on infrastructure. It has raised taxes. Any serious government would now reaffirm its determination to get the economy under control. Mr Clegg, perhaps, has done us all a service. He has reminded us that this is not a serious government. Its lasting contribution to politics could be to allow an undeserving Labour Party back into power at the next election. The reality is, capital funding, as the First Minister said, is £3 billion less than it was in 2009. And I wanted to pick one point up with the leader of the Labour Party, Presiding Officer, when she talked about council housing, and she denounced the SNP's spending on housing. But in 2011-12, 1,011 council homes were built in that financial year. Could she perhaps remind us under which housing minister the lowest number of affordable houses were built under devolution, and under which party built only 6 council houses in over a 4-year period? Ms Lamont.
I'm sure the member will welcome and celebrate the £1 billion housing investment in our city, where he had the courage to support our policy of stock transfer and investment in Glasgow housing, unlike his friends in his own party.
Kenny Gibson.
This forthcoming parliamentary session, Presiding Officer, will surely be one of the busiest, with a financial memoranda, every one of the 15 bills coming before the Finance Committee for scrutiny. And my colleagues and I in the Finance Committee look forward to this challenge, and I'm sure the Scottish Government's programme of legislation will help create a better, fairer Scotland for all. And indeed, we will be leading on the Freedom for Information Amendment Scotland Bill. Of course, progressive policies and a desire to make Scotland a better place to live and work has been a hallmark of the SNP's time in government. Just briefly.
Margaret MacDonald.
Thank you. The making of a better, fairer Scotland. How can that be the case when in 2 years' time it's estimated that there will be 500,000 Scots taking home food parcels? We are pushing water uphill to proceed with devolution as a means of funding everything we need.
I don't actually support continuation of devolution beyond the referendum, as she knows. I support an independence for Scotland. Of course, as we've heard, our older people are entitled to free personal care, free prescriptions, free bus travel, and their NHS has been safeguarded from Westminster cuts. Scotland's streets are safer than ever, with crime at its lowest level since 1975 and 1,139 police officers. With this record, it's clear why the SNP won the overwhelming trust of the Scottish people last year, and it's also why Scotland's economy has proven to be more resilient than other areas of the UK, with a shorter and shallower downturn. The forthcoming legislative programme intends to further build on these achievements and reward the trust the people of Scotland have placed in this government, and the programme will be varied and wide-ranging, as we have heard. We will build on progress in sustaining jobs in the Scottish economy. However, a bill which already has many people discussing it over recent weeks and months will, of course, be the one which will seek to re-establish Scotland as an independent nation. Of all the small nations of the earth, perhaps only the ancient Greeks surpassed the Scots in their contribution to mankind, said Sir Winston Churchill. It's therefore astonishing to me that anyone can lack faith in the ability of such a talented people to deliver a thriving, fairer and dynamic future through independence. And we've heard the word ambition today, but I have to take issue with the leader of the Labour Party, who seems to think that it's ambitious to want your country to be run from Westminster, but not ambitious to want Scotland to run its own affairs. That, to me, is a kind of warped way of actually looking at things. It's now abundantly clear that Scotland can no longer afford to remain part of the Union. We have only to look at the success of so many other smaller nations with not a fraction of our resources: Switzerland, Singapore, Luxembourg, to name but some. And GER's figures have shown that Scotland is indeed more prosperous than other parts of the UK and contributes more to it, or would, under an independent Scotland. And of course, while our Norwegian neighbours benefit from a $600 billion oil fund, the UK is saddled with a debt of £1 trillion. If Scotland was to benefit from its own natural resources, our fiscal position would be far healthier than the UK, and Scotland ranks 6th among OECD nations in terms of GDP per capita. Far from being a distraction from the difficult task of economic recovery, as some would paint it, the full powers of independence would provide us with the necessary tools to do this job properly. Instead of borrowing money for vanity projects and white elephants like Trident, independent Scotland could invest in key industries such as renewables to create jobs, grow our economy and tackle climate change. Instead of hammering the poor and disabled while rewarding the super rich, we could create a tax and benefit system fair and progressive to Scotland's needs. As we conduct this great debate, I am sure the powers, opportunities and security independence will bring us something the people of Scotland will find irresistible. And I am delighted that debate will begin in earnest during the Scottish Government's legislative programme. With the powers of independence, with taxation powers, we can capitalise on our strengths in life sciences, take responsibility for welfare, join up benefits, education, employment services and provide fair and decent support for those who need it. We need the full range of policy levers. This legislative programme is important, but think how much more we could do for the people of Scotland with independence.
Thank you very much. Now call on Patricia Ferguson to be followed by Joan McAlpine. 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Today, the First Minister has brought before us his legislative programme for the coming year. And today, we finally have a timeframe for the legislation that will allow the independence referendum to take place. Everyone in this chamber accepts that the SNP has a mandate to hold an independence referendum. And we know that the First Minister has the MSPs to pass the legislation. And we know just how compliant they are to the First Minister's instructions, although he does seem to be testing their limits on NATO somewhat. So there is little doubt that legislation will come forward and it will be passed. What remains in doubt, however, is the detail of that legislation. That doubt should remain when the First Minister benefits from a lifetime conviction, 5 years in office, numerous consultations and deliberations at the taxpayer's expense is truly astounding. Anything other than a single question referendum providing for a clear and unambiguous outcome will be an abuse of the trust placed in the SNP by the people of Scotland. This will be the single most important decision that the people of Scotland will be asked to make. And the First Minister must stop using it as his own personal political plaything. Devolution and independence are not the same, and it's simply wrong to suggest that they should appear on the same ballot paper. Scotland deserves better. Scotland deserves the chance to determine whether it wants to separate from the rest of the United Kingdom, and it deserves the facts to allow it to make that decision. The First Minister's government needs to start making decisions and give the people of Scotland the information they need to make an informed choice. Because while we on the opposition benches try to tie the First Minister's government down to making those decisions about the process, people in offices and schools and factories around the country have already started to have the debate about independence, but without having a clear idea about what it would mean for them, their families and their communities. The First Minister may think that the current situation suits him. He clearly thinks it allows him to portray himself as the Scottish David against the Tory Goliath at Westminster. But this is a battle manufactured by the First Minister, and it does a great disservice to the people of Scotland. And while playing out this manufactured battle loudly and on the front pages of Scotland's newspapers, he is also quietly battling on another manufactured front, the First Minister's battle against Scotland's own freedom of information law, a battle conducted at the taxpayer's expense, a battle to keep from disclosing exactly the kind of information the people of Scotland deserve to have, legal opinion on a separate Scotland's place in Europe, and Scotland deserves better. To Mrs MacDonald.
Margaret MacDonald.
I thank my friend. While I agree with her that the government has a duty to set out the possible routes that independence might take in terms of policy, because of course it's up to whoever's elected after independence to determine which policy will be in vogue. Doesn't the member also believe that the government in Westminster, as represented by the coalition backed up by our own party just now, should give us the facts for what they see in 10 years' time?
Patricia Ferguson.
Well, I wouldn't accept Mr MacDonald's assertion that my party is backing up the coalition government. Anything but. And I have to say that pots and kettles tend to come to mind when I hear members of the SNP talking about my government's position. And it was, as Ms Lamont reminded us earlier, Mr Salmond himself who said, don't vote for Labour, don't vote for them, and he has reaped the wind that he has sown. What Scotland needs now is to hear what the First Minister's vision is, not his vision of the number of questions on a ballot paper, not his vision of how he sees himself remembered in the future, but his vision of the kind of Scotland he thinks separation will deliver. Mr Salmond.
Alex Salmond. I did ask people not to vote Labour last year, and they didn't. But I'm interested in the denial of the obvious, that her party is now not just supporting the Conservative and Liberal government, they're in cahoots. Yes. They're in part of a joint arrangement, a Better Together campaign. Yes. So how does the member get uncomfortable by being reminded by Margaret MacDonald that she and her party are supporting the Conservatives and the Liberals in a joint campaign to try and convince the people of Scotland not to take charge of their own destiny?
Patricia Ferguson.
I think the First Minister is being rather disingenuous. And those of us who have been in politics for some time will remember that actually the SNP has more to be embarrassed about the coalitions it has formed in UK politics than any other party in this chamber. Now, the First Minister might assert that his vision is for a Scotland with, and I quote, the ability to take our own decisions. That is, after all, what his manifesto said. But since then, we have witnessed the First Minister becoming increasingly lukewarm on the issue of decision-making, ceding powers not yet won to institutions over which a separate Scotland would have no control. His much talked-of economic levers would lie in the hands of the Bank of England. And now he even wants a separate Scotland to remain in NATO. No doubt he believes a separate Scotland can be independent in NATO as well as independent in Europe. But to the First Minister, it is all just a slogan, whatever it takes to win a vote. To the people of Scotland, however, it is about their future and their children's future, not Alex Salmond's place in the history books. Scotland deserves better, and the members of this chamber deserve better than the kind of antics we sometimes see and are seeing today from the SNP front bench when members in this chamber rise to speak. In the absence of a coherent vision, thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer, I'll do that. In the absence of a coherent vision, the people of Scotland will and are deciding what a separate SNP Scotland would look like. They are using the evidence available right now to make that decision. They are looking at the drop in nursing numbers, they are looking at the cuts in college funding, and they are looking at a government that is described as feeble on fuel poverty. The people of Scotland are making their decision on these.
Thank you. Point of order.
Provide me with some advice on the use of electronic devices in the chamber, because I understand that over the last hour the First Minister has been multitasking and has sent no less than 31 tweets invisibly during his speech. I wonder if you can advise me on the protocol for using such electronic devices in the chamber.
Thank you. I will reflect on your point of order, and I'll get back to you at decision time about it. Thank you very much. I now call on Joan McAlpine to be followed by Lewis MacDonald. Mike Russell, point of order.
Must have been reading an electronic device or been informed by electronic device, so I presume your ruling will cover both parts of that equation.
Thank you. We will. I now call on Joan McAlpine to be followed by Lewis MacDonald. 6 minutes, please.
Presiding Officer, I'm interested to note from Patricia Ferguson's comments that the Labour Party no longer seems to think that
members of NATO or independent countries. I think that will come as news to France, Denmark, the UK. The front-bench spokesmen of the Labour and Tory alliances are doing their best with the scripts that they are given. Unfortunately for them, the Scottish people have heard all this negative naysaying a million times before, but they are unconvinced. The Scottish Social Attitudes Survey showed that 71% of people trust the Scottish Government to act in Scotland's best interests. That's a 10% increase on 2010. Willie Rennie's speech was more balanced, but I would put it to him that his own party has believed in Home Rule for longer than the SNP ever existed. Why, now that the Liberal Democrats are in power in Westminster, have they not just abandoned their long-standing commitment to Home Rule, but any discussion of Home Rule as well? Yes?
I find that rather strange, because we've delivered the Scotland Act, quite substantial powers, and we've got a commission under the chairmanship of Sir Ming Campbell, which is moving forward to the next stage of Home Rule. So I'm not sure how that comes to abandoning our long-term commitment. Could you maybe explain?
John McAlpine.
Well, I sat in the Scotland Bill Committee with Willie Rennie and noted how he blocked any opportunities that he did have to advance the powers of this Parliament within devolution. This year's... No, you've already had your say, I'm sorry. This year's legislative programme continues the Government's ambitious and responsive approach to governing Scotland. It addresses the issue of fairness, for example, in the Marriage and Civil Partnership Bill, whose principles have support right across this chamber and across wider society. The legislative programme also responds to public concerns about the state of the economy, the need for jobs, a situation exacerbated by the Westminster Government's disastrous deflationary economic policies. With the powers we have in this Parliament, this Government seeks to make things better here. The procurement reform bill in this legislative programme is a particularly good example of how the Government responds to concerns of business, trade unions and communities. Public sector procurement represents $9 billion a year, and it's essential that we do everything we can to ensure that it's spent well. This is an ambitious bill because anyone working with a working knowledge of the subject will tell you that the constraints imposed by public authorities by EU procurement rules are considerable. For example, the EU's Remedies Directive, which was implemented into Scots law in 2009, means that a contract can be automatically suspended without the need for an interim interdict if a summons is served. Clearly, a public procuring authority who gets things wrong can pay a high price, and let's remember that when we talk. And let's remember when we talk about that procuring authorities do not just mean Scottish Government and local authorities. The definition of a contracting authority is extremely wide, and there are all sorts of small arm's-length organisations subject to EU procurement rules. Earlier this year, a former head of procurement at Whitehall, Peter Smith, told the BBC of risk aversion in contract decisions, with officials fearing criticism for awarding contracts on factors other than cost, and he also highlighted confusion over regulation. Yes.
Helen Eady. Microphone.
I'm very surprised that you're talking in such terms about fairness and all the rest of it, when so far as I can see, there's not a single member of the SNP at Westminster has done anything to help the beleaguered Remploy workers. And I haven't had any report backs from the Scottish Government about what you're actually doing here in terms of the procurement work that is happening to Remploy workers. And that is a dramatic and it's a very devastating situation when we've got people who right across Scotland are going to lose their jobs. So where is the fairness in terms of the competence of your government? Where is the justice? Where is the right in that for the Scottish people?
John McAlpine.
I think it's very clear that the Scottish Government is doing everything it can to help in the situation that employed workers find themselves in. However, while EU rules may be strict, they do allow for factors other than price to be taken into account where appropriate. So I welcome that the bill will introduce a statutory requirement that public sector bodies include community benefit clauses in all new public sector contracts, and in particular that those in receipt of those contracts publish their commitments on training and apprenticeships. Small and medium-sized enterprises are the backbone of the Scottish economy, and it's encouraging that they win 3/4 of the contracts currently advertised on Public Contracts Scotland, and I look forward to this increasing with the legislation. It's right that the Government should support a wide consultation on the living wage resulting from Mr Park's bill, and I very much hope that a way can be found to pay workers a living wage without breaching EU procurement rules. The procurement bill is an ambitious attempt to use the powers we have in this Parliament to maximise employment and deliver on the SNP's commitment to fairness and prosperity. But only full control of our economy will deliver all our objectives, and only the restoration of full powers of independence to this Parliament will see our country fulfil its potential. That is what connects the referendum bill to the other bills in this programme, and that is why this programme is truly ambitious for the people of Scotland. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now call on Lewis MacDonald to be followed by Rob Gibson. An exact 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. We welcome the announcement that ministers will bring forward bills to support victims and to reform aspects of the Scottish legal system, and we will engage in the parliamentary debate on those measures, but we will also seek to strengthen them where we believe they fall short or they've got the balance wrong, and we will point out other areas where government action is still awaited. We welcome in particular the proposal for a Victims and Witnesses Bill, and we will continue to press ministers to ensure that that bill includes measures which will make it effective in meeting the aspirations of victims and those who champion their cause. The Scottish Government has resisted thus far the proposals that Labour has made for a Victims Charter and a Victims Commissioner, and we believe those proposals should emerge at the end of the legislative process. We believe the proposals they have made in their consultation on the bill are welcome in large part, but that in general they do not go far enough. For example, to provide victims and witnesses with advice before they attend court is desirable, but we know that the sentence handed down can be so complex that even legal experts have trouble in disentangling the rules. And when Parliament debated and agreed the Criminal Cases Bill in June, it was commented that many of the aspects of that Act would not go far enough to sort out those complications. A Sentencing Council, on the other hand, was agreed by this Parliament 2 years ago and would help to resolve those issues by reforming complex sentencing options. That does not require new legislation, but it requires political will, and that is something we have not yet seen. A Victims Charter would go further than the minimum standards proposed in the consultation. Enshrining the rights of victims and witnesses in legislation will encourage more people to come forward, and the specialist courts which deal with the victims of domestic abuse and sexual crimes should be rolled out across the country to ensure people across Scotland have access to the same levels of justice. A Victims Commissioner would also help to redress the balance when so many victims fear that the justice system looks after the offender rather than them, and look to the government to redress that balance. It has been said that a full-time commissioner could cost the taxpayer £500,000, and so is too expensive a thing to do. But victims know that legal aid for a single convicted criminal who is determined to pursue every possible avenue for appeal can cost the taxpayer £500,000. So arguing against the Victims Commissioner on grounds of cost will simply not persuade many people. And if it's the right thing to do, government should do it. And that is an argument for proper support for victims, but it is not an argument for restricting access to criminal legal aid. The Civil Justice Council and Criminal Legal Assistance Bill is already in the parliamentary process and will be one of the measures to be determined in this parliamentary session. As this goes forward, in tandem with the Criminal Justice Bill, it is essential that ministers listen to those whose concern is around access to justice for all. For example, at the present time, there is no provision for recompense to those found not guilty, but who have spent their own savings to prove their innocence. There must be no perverse incentives to plead guilty for those who are not, but who fear the financial consequences of a trial for their families. And it will be up to ministers and to Parliament to ensure that that does not happen. Scottish Labour welcomed the Carloway Review, and we welcome the proposed Criminal Justice Bill to implement it. But the impact of changes to one part of Scots law on the balance of the whole system must be carefully and fully considered. Experts such as the Scottish Law Commission and legal practitioners must be closely involved and consulted on the implications, both in our domestic courts and internationally as well. The centrepiece of the Carloway proposals is the removal of the requirement for corroboration. That is not something to be cast aside lightly, as the Scottish Law Commission has made clear. But there is little doubt that some who have committed crimes have walked free, slowly because the prosecution case did not meet the test of corroboration in a technical sense. And it is equally clear that Cadder has altered the balance of the legal system in a way that increases the likelihood of that happening in future. Crimes such as sexual violence, rape, domestic abuse often fail to produce convictions because of the requirement for corroboration as it currently stands. That should be addressed in order to convict the guilty, but removing the requirement for corroboration should be done in a way that protects the innocent too. At the moment, guilt in a jury trial has to be proved beyond reasonable doubt to a simple majority of jurors. It is enough to convince 8 out of 15 jurors that the accused is guilty, even when the other 7 disagree. If the requirement for corroboration is to be removed, therefore, action on reforming criminal verdicts becomes all the more important. That is why my colleague Michael McMahon is currently proposing a member's bill to include the question of the majority required for a conviction and to raise the issue of the not proven verdict. That verdict is variously seen as an anomaly or as a second-rate finding, although in law it is merely a different form of acquittal. Where corroboration is no longer a requirement, the case for removing the option for not proven is all the stronger, and I hope this is an area where ministers will engage with the parliamentary debate in a constructive way. There are other measures coming forward, and also areas where government is not proposing measures. Areas, for example, like fatal accident inquiries, for which ministers say they lack the parliamentary time. And there are other things that ministers should do for which legislation is not required, such as finding out the root causes and discovering how the current crisis of drug-related death involving methadone has reached this stage. There are real issues of substance to be debated, and to include government bills for which there is broad agreement across parties. I would call on ministers in this session to build on that agreement and not to lose it, as they did on a number of justice measures in the last session.
Many thanks. Now call on Rob Gibson to be followed by Liz Smith. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Government's programme contains both new bills and ongoing work to improve life in Scotland, and I would like to focus on greening Scotland, which is contained in the Government's programme. The Common Agriculture Policy, which is making its way through Europe at the moment, is one of the biggest pieces of domestic legislation to be tackled this year. It's split into several pillars, 2 pillars, of which the first brings £500 million into the pockets of Scottish farmers to produce the quality food that has given us such a strong reputation in the world. The CAP is decided by co-decision between the Council of Ministers and the EU Parliament, and it's important for us that we have a voice at that top table, because once the Parliament has looked at the 7,000 amendments that it needs to vote on before the end of November, we need to have someone there and our MEPs, first of all, sifting these to make sure that Scotland's interests are looked after. But I would remind you that Richard Lochhead, the Cabinet Secretary, told the Race Committee on the 14th of March that if we were an EU member state in our own right, the proposed convergence criteria would deliver anything between 170 million and 190 million a year in Scotland, which would be a substantial boost and would give us many more options for targeting support within Scotland. The less favoured areas, which make up 85% of Scottish farming, would stand to benefit if we were a member state, because the convergence criteria would give us an opportunity to target support. Presiding Officer, I turn to the Common Fisheries Policy, and battling to gain greater regionalisation would be more strongly put by the Scottish ministers when Westminster's priorities clash often with ours. Again, a Scottish seat at the top table would foster our interests directly. Now, in the last year, because of the Scotland Bill, the Crown Estate Commission at the present time has been barred from Scottish control by the Tory Liberal Westminster coalition. And I believe that until it's in our control and in this Parliament, as the Scottish Affairs Committee has suggested from Westminster, and that we have discussed and passed as a majority here, then we're not going to be able to control the marine area in a constructive fashion. But I hope in the meantime that the Scottish Government can look at ways to lift the burdens of Crown Estate Commission taxes on trust ports and coastal local authorities, and that work can perhaps proceed ahead of gaining more powers. As far as land reform is concerned, the Leader of the Opposition mentioned the fact that this had been long-standing and that there was an honourable record. Well, indeed, but the Land Reform Review Group, which has been set up by the Scottish Government in July under the chairpersonship of Dr Alison Elliott, is going to make sure that we insist that not just developing new ideas that will improve current legislation, but also generating more innovative proposals come about. And I would suggest to her that if she visited Lewis, then she should have gone to see the Park Estate, where the residents are trying, in a hostile bid under the previous legislation, to get control of their land. It is so complex and so difficult that it must be reformed, and that's why this is one of the key parts of land reform here, which will touch all parts of Scotland, enabling more people in rural and urban Scotland to have a stake in the ownership, governance, management and use of our land. I believe it will be essential to a confident Scotland that land reform succeeds, and we look for support across this chamber. Now, the committee to which I convened, the RACI committee, received several pieces of private or anonymous evidence when we were looking at the Agricultural Holdings Bill, and as a result, we've started to look at various parts of Scotland to see problems that are faced by tenant farmers. In so doing, we welcome the fact that the industry-led Tenant Farming Forum, the industry body which has developed 7 individual work streams, will be reporting by December 2013 on such issues as data collection, equipment repairs and renewals, holding investment, wage-go compensation, diversification, succession and assignation. All of these are critical to having a secure tenant farming sector. But one of the issues which I followed up myself from a delegation which visited Butte was to look at the conditions that are against this security. And having surveyed tenant farmers' houses in several islands and on the mainland, I have seen many of these as a very poor example of repair. I can only echo Dr Brenda Boardman's talk on fuel poverty in yesterday's Herald newspaper, that property owners should foot the bill for wind and watertight buildings, and she said, landlords have to be responsible, they are the key. It's as much a matter for landlords who have tenant farmers as those who rent houses in the cities. I would go back and suggest that in terms of bills, we're going to have an aquaculture bill which will be lodged, we believe, in the late autumn. And the natural environment, our food producers and land users can have confidence that this Scottish Government is ambitious for Scotland. But we must make sure that all parts of Scotland are helping our emission reduction. And at the present time, this is necessary in the transport and in the residential sector a good deal more than at present. So the rewetting of peatlands couldn't reduce large amounts of carbon emissions, and now that the United Nations is measuring this, Scotland can invest in our peatlands as a resource to help reduce our carbon footprint. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now call on Liz Smith to be followed by Chick Brodie.
Deputy Presiding Officer, as well as the momentous decision that the Scottish people will make over the coming months about their constitutional future, there will rightly also be the closest scrutiny of the Scottish Government's political record and its current programme for government. In particular, does the electorate believe that the correct priorities have been chosen, and whether or not the Scottish Government has laid the foundation for a much more secure economy? Indeed, both sides in the unionist independence debate should rightly expect the highest level of public scrutiny, and therefore it is incumbent upon all of us to provide the facts on which the public can make up their minds about whether or not they want Scotland to remain part of the United Kingdom. Much of that debate is about the efficacy of the policies which affect their everyday lives. And after today and tomorrow, we will know much more about how the Scottish Government intends to respond to these expectations, and I am sure that much of that debate will continue to be as robust as it has been this afternoon, and that's exactly how it should be. But as well as that policy debate, there is a much more fundamental philosophical debate going on, fashioned partly by the unionist parties and the nationalist respective beliefs about the nature of the state and the appropriate social and economic structure for modern Scotland. Because apart from the internal debates within the SNP about NATO, about which currency to use or what is the appropriate approach to energy policy, there is another debate about how far to extend the powers of the state, because there are very clear signs that the Scottish Government is increasingly interventionist. And the most obvious example of that just now is in wind farm development, for which, despite the very firm promises that the SNP made in its 2011 manifesto to devolve more power to local communities, the Scottish Government has adopted a very direct interventionist approach, even if it means overriding local democracy. How many times in recent months have we seen the Scottish Government ignore the wishes of local people when it comes to proposed wind farm developments, because it is so obsessed with meeting its own energy targets? Of course.
Patrick Harvey.
I'm grateful, and I'm curious about the slightly changing tone of voice from the Conservatives over recent months on this issue. The Conservatives voted for the climate change targets in the last Parliament and endorsed them again in this Parliament. It's clear that those targets are unreachable without the decarbonisation of our electricity supply. So is the Conservative Party actually dropping that former commitment, or do they agree that we need renewable energy onto the grid?
Liz Smith.
With respect, it's a completely different issue. These are about the demands of the local communities. And if these local communities speak out forcibly that they don't want a particular wind farm, then that is something that we have to take cognizance of. But let me turn. Can I just make a little progress? Perhaps it is in the area of education where this debate is most acute. Now, let me take two examples. Firstly, in the terms of the Children and Young People's Bill, because there are very clear, laudable intentions in quite a bit of that bill. Ambitions to improve child welfare, to develop better kinship care, better coherency over the provision of children's services, and most specifically, the delivery of better services for our more vulnerable young people. And it is entirely right that the Education Committee tackles the very difficult question of whether it is right to remove children from their parents if the latter are unable to demonstrate that they can cope effectively. That debate is an important one, and one which is long overdue, because how often have we heard complaints from expert witnesses at the Education Committee that all too often we are very good at identifying the problems, but we cannot come up with the answers. But let me be quite clear that there are some aspects of the Scottish Government's proposed legislation which threaten to extend the powers of the state to an unacceptable level, thereby undermining family life and the responsibilities which first and foremost should be exercised by parents and families. And on this side of the chamber, we have grave reservations about the proposed extension of the powers of the Children's Commissioner to exclude reporting on perhaps a parent or a teacher or a social worker from an individual child. That is fraught with all kinds of difficulties, and we will certainly not support any extension of the nanny state to interfere in matters which are not for government. And that bill strikes at the very heart of this debate, and I think it is something that this Parliament will debate over and over again. But may I now turn to our colleges and universities, which have been much in the news of late. Institutions which are amongst the finest further and higher education schools in the world. They are successful because of long-standing traditions and structures, many centuries old in many cases, that are built upon all that is best in Scottish education, on academic excellence, a level playing field for opportunity, on internationalism and on institutional autonomy. Their success is their own, and it is a well-proven fact that colleges and universities around the world achieve most when they are as free as possible from government intervention. And let me deal very specifically with two issues. Of course, widening access is an important debate, but it is not one that is about percentage targets or artificial numerical percentages. It should be a debate that is about a qualitative approach and ensuring that there is a level playing field across the board. Setting artificial targets for universities is wrong on three counts. It misses the point about where the real problem lies, because that is in schools. And that is something that we must ensure we target our energies of. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now call on Chick Brodie to be followed by Margaret McCulloch.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I support, of course, this programme for 2012-13. A government programme, I believe, that builds upon the successes and the foundations, even in straitened times, of the previous 5 years. Presiding Officer, we were advised at the Business in Parliament conference in June to embrace change or to wither. And the further changes enshrined in these 15 bills, I believe, do that. This morning on GMS, John Curtis said and asked, what was the narrative of this government? Well, I answer thus. A brand that has a story to tell has meaning. And a brand that has meaning will have impact and resonance. And even in constrained circumstances, the impact and the resonance of Scotland, the brand, is there to continue to raise the aspirations of our people, making Scotland more successful with more opportunities, more benefits, and to secure sustainable jobs and growth. We have a story to tell. Now, we know what constrains us, and we also know that this programme sets us on the road to remove that constraint. And importantly, as ever in these tight times, will be the budget bill, which, as I say, even constrained, will continue to embed further the trust of the Scottish people in the competence of this government's economic management. Not for us, the hokey-cokey economics of a hokey-cokey Westminster government. You know how it goes. You put one tax in, you take the same tax out. You put another tax in, and you shake it all about. And you know, it was unbelievable to hear the leader of the Tory parties talk breathtakingly about, she talked lots about Scotland's liabilities, but didn't mention Scotland's assets. And then she went on to criticise the lack of capital funding and the impact it has on construction and why we weren't doing enough on that. The very thing that her Tory Chancellor in London is now doing months after he was told that was the answer to economic disaster. But it's not just about trust and competence, Presiding Officer. It's about fairness. And in particular, I welcome the proposed procurement reform bill, which will, of course.
Ruth Davison. Could I have Ruth Davison's microphone, please? I'm sorry, we've got no microphone.
Oh, my card's not in. My own fault. Oh, I hold my hands up, Deputy Presiding Officer, and I
Perhaps we could have Ruth Davison's microphone now, and I'll give a bit of extra time to check.
I apologise to the member for that oversight, but I was asking him whether he was suggesting that the Scottish Government was in fact not cutting over 4 years investment in housing by over £100 million from £389.6 million to £272.7 million, because I think if that is a suggestion, he could probably tell the Finance Secretary.
Check Brodie.
I understand Ms Davidson asking that question, but she has to stop trying to rewrite and make a selective history of what has happened in terms of her government cutting the overall capital spend to this government. But it's not just about trust and competence, it's about fairness, and in particular I welcome the proposed procurement reform bill, which I believe will add to create even more openness, integrity and community benefit to public service contracts. And, Presiding Officer, notwithstanding the European Commission's statement on legislated payment of the living wage by contractors, I wish to applaud and commend John Park's efforts in consultation and proposals on this particular issue. It is my hope that the reform bill will make clear we want public bodies to encourage, as the Commission says we can do, to encourage contractors to start to pay their employees a living wage through the buying process. Not only can the bill do that, but it can manage a major ongoing community revolution to support, promote, manage the development of SMEs, cooperatives, the voluntary sector, the third sector, social enterprises as key players in the provision of outsourced public services, and in so doing, connect with and employ and train the young of Scotland as stakeholders in those new endeavours. There is an example of the Clean Clothes Company in Dundee, which has manifestly created that particular situation. So let the young knock down the shibboleths of the old and accepted way of doing things, and encourage them to innovate, to start up businesses and to grow. Presiding Officer, the Better Regulation Bill also does the same, and limited though it may be, it will help grow businesses and protect the environment. We have to challenge regulations and guidelines and improve them wherever they are. Are they necessary? If enabled, are they working? Are they applied consistently? Are they cost-effective? Do they allow for faster cycles of cash flow? Do they add value? On all regulations, to start with, and ones that are working, we have to keep asking the question, why? Ask, why do we follow certain processes, particularly in planning, where planners are seen sometimes and recognised as not helping businesses, but rather hindering them. So, Presiding Officer, I believe the Government's programme across all facets faces the challenges, not just the immediate economic ones, but major constitutional, cultural and demographic changes too. And, Presiding Officer, challenges and changes are constant. They will be met, they will be confronted, and that's the narrative of this party and this government, Mr Curtis.
Many thanks. Margaret McCulloch, to be followed by John Mason.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As members return to the Scottish Parliament this week, the referendum bill might be topical, but the economy must be foremost on our minds. In bringing forward the draft budget last year, the Scottish Government promised to squeeze every penny out of every pound and to link their spending decisions back to their core objective of sustainable economic growth. However, a succession of experts came before the Finance Committee to argue that the Government wasn't doing enough to explain how their spending decisions would contribute towards those strategic objectives. The Committee's own budget adviser suggested that the Government could do more to explain how the draft budget would support government policy such as the economic strategy. There is no shortage of evidence highlighting the stimulus effects of capital investment in our economy, and there is no shortage of demands on capital budgets. In an economy in which business is reluctant to invest, government intervention can make a big difference, but we have to explore new ways of financing capital budgets given the austerity measures that are being imposed. Maintaining Scotland's water and sewerage network is a capital-intensive business, and so Scottish Water, as an organisation, is always capital-hungry. It stands to reason that we should therefore look at new ways of generating income for Scottish Water as part of the hydronation agenda, although I noticed there was no mention of the Water Resources Bill today in the First Minister's speech. I welcome the announcement that there will be another transfer from the resources budget to the capital budget over the next 3 years. This has long been supported by Scottish Labour and is a welcome capital injection into the Scottish economy. However, I would press the Scottish Government for more details on where this investment is to be directed. There is a difference between a project getting listed in the infrastructure investment plan and actually being shovel-ready. And, Presiding Officer, there are other ways in which we can stimulate activity in the economy if we are prepared to innovate. I would like to acknowledge the ongoing consultation process on the Procurement Reform Bill, and I would encourage the business community to respond to the document. In particular, I hope they will have their say in Part 2, which deals with SMEs and start-ups. Too often, SMEs are at a disadvantage because they can be outbid by big businesses that cream off the best bits of the contract and subcontract the leftovers. I am clear that for those businesses, indeed for all businesses, the public procurement process has to be more accessible and more transparent. Only a few days ago, Mike Levac from the Scottish Building Federation described procurement for construction as a lottery. And for some time, the Federation of Small Businesses have argued that the aggregation of projects into big contracts can put public work out of reach for SMEs. I've been working with the SBF and the FSB and Business Gateways in Lanarkshire to look at a model for bringing micro-businesses into consortia at the local level to help them bid for contracts or subcontracting opportunities. I think it's important that we identify and share best practices for small businesses, but if we want real, lasting change in procurement, then we need new legislation. Of course, this bill is an opportunity to do more than just reform public procurement. It's our chance to use the purchasing power of the Scottish public sector
to drive change in the economy and promote employment, apprenticeships and skills. Yet I find that I'm disappointed with the language in this part of the consultation. It's a paper full of suggestions that companies should be asked, encouraged or required to consider all kinds of action, but there are no concrete measures. For months, the Cabinet Secretary says he was seeking advice from the EU on what he could legally ask of suppliers while we all waited in anticipation. If the suggestions in this consultation are as good as it gets with the Procurement Reform Bill, then we need to test the advice he has received, and we need to have a much broader debate about how we make the purchasing power of the Government really work for the people of Scotland. Presiding Officer, as we've seen today, the coming months are likely to be dominated by the referendum debate. I look forward to participating in that debate, but we cannot lose sight of the economy, given the scale of what is now our second recession in 4 years. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before I call the next speaker, can I remind the Chamber that very short conversations are acceptable, but prolonged conversations, including in the front bench, should be conducted either at the back of the chamber or outside, and can I also remind members to turn off their mobile phones and other devices. Thank you very much. I now call John Mason to be followed by John Park.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I really have to start my speech today by welcoming the planned bill on the referendum. The Constitution really is central to everything else that we do. And I think that's where the last speaker slightly missed the point. If we have the Constitution right, then we can have fairer and more progressive taxes, we can have an end to nuclear weapons, we can stop being involved in illegal foreign wars, we can use real resources to create jobs and tackle poverty, we can raise the statutory minimum wage. All of these depend on a better constitutional settlement. And nowhere is that more obvious than for the budget. We need to have a separate budget for this country. The range of options we would then have is huge. Welfare reform, which we can only tinker with at the moment. Capital expenditure, which is far too restricted by Westminster. We need the full range of taxes if we are to be serious about redistributing income and wealth. I do welcome many other parts of the Government's programme, and would like to touch on the Commonwealth Games, which particularly appears in my constituency. I do very much welcome the fact that there is preparedness to amend legislation, if necessary, following on lessons from the London Olympics. They appear to have been a great success, but there is always room for improvement. And clearly, transport issues are one of the things that I think might be considered. And yes,
Patrick Harvey.
I'm grateful to the member for giving way. Would he agree with me that one of the lessons we could take from the Olympics is that public protest and the freedom for people to challenge the messages, for example, of sponsors with dodgy corporate records, that's one of the things where we need to make sure that we're not repeating the mistakes of the Olympics when the Commonwealth Games come to Glasgow?
John Mason.
Yes, I think, the idea that you could only use one product in a certain place and quite a lot of restriction about gathering and things, I find personally distasteful, I have to say. And the products as well, I'd like to see, I've got a local brewer in my constituency, I'd like to see their product on sale, not just one huge multinational product. To touch on the tax bills too, I think we want to welcome the fact that Revenue Scotland is being set up, that they will work closely with SEPA and Registers of Scotland. I think many people are not happy with the HMRC and feel it is unnecessarily bureaucratic and expensive. And surely, again, this is one of the advantages of being a small country, that we can be less bureaucratic, we can have simpler systems which are more friendly for the user. ICAS and others have helped us think about what kind of tax system would Scotland want. And of course, we're going to look particularly at the land buildings transaction tax and the encouraging signs that that is going to be a more progressive tax, and also the landfill tax, which is largely to be like for like and revenue neutral, but still a very important piece of legislation if we're serious about preventing, reusing and recycling waste. I'd like to touch on an area that has not been given much coverage so far, and that is same-sex marriage. Clearly, this topic has provoked more interest among the public than some of our deliberations in this place. We do seem to have an issue that the wide range of views, and often strongly held views, amongst the public at large is not completely fully reflected in this Parliament. It does seem that all the party leaders, and possibly a majority in each of the parties, do support the introduction of same-sex marriage, whereas amongst constituents there is much more of a balance on both sides. I do welcome assurances that there will be a free vote on this matter and that this will apply to both frontbench and backbench MSPs. So, first, Presiding Officer, I do hope that you and your colleagues will enable debate within this chamber, as it would seem to me a failure for this Parliament if the public was debating a subject and we were not to debate it properly. Secondly, can I say that I do seem to hold a minority view on this subject, at least within this chamber. The subject touches on a range of issues, including the relationship of church and state, and that has been a thorny issue in Scotland for hundreds of years, and in other countries perhaps for even longer. There may be elements of the church who want a very close constitutional relationship between the church and the state, but that is not my desire in any way. I want to see a clear separation of church and state. And in many ways, I think we are heading towards a more healthy relationship between the two than we have sometimes seen in the past. Therefore, while I am clear that God's teaching in the Bible does not support two people of the same sex having a sexual relationship, it is not my aim to try to force Christian values on the wider society against their will. Yes, I do believe that God's way is the best way for all of us, but also God gives us free choice to follow his way or not. Therefore, the key for me in all this continues to be, if we are to have same-sex marriage introduced, will freedom of speech and freedom of religion be maintained? Will the churches and others be allowed to opt out? I do welcome the assurances we have on this from government ministers and also from some of the various pressure groups who have been involved in this subject. But we remain to see how and if this can actually be delivered. There is legal opinion in the public domain that Westminster is unable to protect the churches from a challenge in the European Court of Human Rights if same-sex marriage is permitted at all. And hopefully we can debate and look at that in more detail. Therefore, I look forward to seeing the proposed bill and also especially to how those who disagree with this legislation will be allowed to follow their own beliefs. Presiding Officer, in conclusion, I believe we have a programme to be proud of here, and I think I foresee quite a lot of work for the Finance Committee, but I'm sure we're all up for that, and our workaholic convener, Mr Gibson, will certainly keep us on our toes. Thank you.
Many thanks. I now call John Park to be followed by Stuart McMillan.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer, and welcome the opportunity to speak in this afternoon's debate, and also welcome the opportunity to particularly speak about the issues around procurement and obviously the living wage, I think, which has been mentioned by a couple of members already. The first thing I would say about procurement, and it's been touched on with a couple of contributions, is that there is a contradiction at the heart of where we are just now. The aggregation of contracts, looking for greater efficiencies, have, I feel, led to unintended consequences for smaller businesses who have been wanting to engage in the procurement process. Having said that, I think outside the Chamber, outside the Parliament, there are a number of good examples of companies who have tried to work around this, particularly larger employers who, through their subcontract process, have engaged with smaller employers to ensure that the desired output that we'd like to see, local employment opportunities, training opportunities for local people as well, have actually happened. And I hope during the consultation process that the Scottish Government will take these good examples on board and look to try and define legislation that makes it much easier for these sort of partnerships to happen at a local level. But more importantly in that, I think there does need to be quite strict performance clauses put into these contracts to ensure that there is a mandate, as the First Minister did mention today, around apprenticeship training and around training for people who have maybe been in other industries that want to move into construction and other areas of other sectors of the economy. So I think it's an important bill. It doesn't sound like it's an important bill to people outside Parliament, but certainly it's something I believe it can make a huge difference to employment prospects of the people that I represent in Mid-Scotland and Fife. Now, a big aspect of what I believe is important is what people get paid for a fair day's work. It says a lot about the type of employers we have. It says a lot about the country that we live in. And that's why over the summer I launched a living wage bill that I hope that many people outside the Parliament will engage in and support. And I've had a lot of supportive comments already and some helpful and supportive comments this afternoon. Kevin, you're on a hat-trick.
Kevin Stewart.
Thank Mr Park for giving way, Presiding Officer. On the subject of the living wage, it's something that I very much support as well. But there are difficulties in implementing the living wage in certain procurement contracts because of European legislation. The Riefert versus Niedersachsen case is the prime example of the difficulties. I wonder if Mr Park would agree with me that the best way of overcoming those difficulties would be if Scotland had a seat at the top table in Europe and could actually argue these points there.
John
I
Park.
tell you, the best way of overcoming them is engaging with the consultation process that I launched on the 20th of August and listening to the significant legal opinion that's outside this Parliament. It tells you that the living wage is actually something that's achievable, and we need the political will to make it happen instead of leaving it in the hands of lawyers or where politicians have seats or not. I think that I'll come into a bit more detail on that because I think there's some important issues that we need to touch on with regards to the living wage debate. But look at the political support that we have generated here, right across the chamber, almost across the chamber, around the living wage, across Scotland more widely as well, across local government. It was an issue that most parties in this chamber took forward and promoted during the recent local government campaign. It's been referred to today, as I said, on many occasions by members, and I do believe that there's 550,000 people out there in the private sector who would like to see some moves made through public procurement to ensure that the living wage can be paid to them, that they're actually falling in to that same level of benefit that we are trying to promote, not just for directly employed people in Scottish Government, but what we're managing to achieve in local government as well. So I think with the political wills there, actually an understanding of what the living wage is now, I do believe that's something that we could achieve. The second part of my bill, and this is not John Park's programme for government, certainly.
Bruce Crawford.
I thank the member for taking my intervention. I very much appreciate the way that John's actually going about this debate this afternoon in a very measured way. I heard the response.
Sorry, Cabinet Secretary asked you to put your card in.
That might help, eh?
Could I have the Cabinet Secretary's microphone, please?
You think I would know that by now, wouldn't you? In terms of, as I said, I very much appreciate the way you've approached this debate this afternoon, Mr Park. I just wonder, I heard your response to Kevin about the whole issue of whether or not it's within the European law or not, and I heard your response to that. But in terms of the general economy, is it not your understanding that to have a living wage put in the private sector in the general economy, actually, that the only way we can achieve that is through powers that are still at Westminster?
John Park, and I'll give you an extra minute for the interventions.
Thank you. The point I'm making is that we're talking about here and now and what we're trying to achieve. And the consultation response that I gave to Kevin Stewart is exactly the same one that I'll give to you, because I believe that there is support for what I'm trying to achieve here, and hence the reason that I brought it forward in the way that I did, in a constructive fashion. Because I launched my bill on the 20th of August, and on the 22nd of August there was a Scottish procurement policy note went out from the Scottish Government, basically saying that the European Commission has clarified that public bodies cannot require, underlined in bold, contractors to pay their employees a living wage as a condition of participating in a tendering exercise. Now, if in the spirit of trying to move forward in a constructive fashion, I wouldn't say that this is a helpful correspondence to go out to stakeholders. There's a consultation process open from a backbench member. I would hope that I'll be able to engage with the Scottish Government on that and try and find a way ahead. Now, the reality is that Alec Neil did write to ministers about this. I appreciate he's given me a copy of the response. There are commissioners in the European Parliament who perhaps take a different view on this, and I think this is an ongoing process. The political will's here. We've achieved things in the Scottish Parliament, and I hope that certainly I'll get the backbench support that we needed to take it forward and have a decent debate about the living wage in Scotland.
Thank you very much. Just before we move on, can I also remind members to address each other by their full names, please, and avoid first names, nicknames or any other form of address. Thank you. Stuart McMillan, to be followed by Patrick Harvey.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And at the outset, I welcome the programme of bills announced by the First Minister today. I also, as a member of the Economy, Energy and Tourism Committee, I anticipate actually quite a busy year ahead with the Better Regulation Bill and the Procurement Reform Bill. I think actually both of these bills can make a positive difference to the communities we serve as parliamentarians. Now, one of the areas that I have questioned the Cabinet Secretary of Finance on in the past is that of the community benefit clauses. And I know other members have actually raised the same issue also. Now, whilst they can be used at the moment, I would like to think that the Procurement Reform Bill can actually enhance them. We do, however, have to strike the balance of aiding communities with the legal implications from the European Union. Now, furthermore, also, I don't want competition removed, because that would be disastrous. But I believe that there can be an enhanced method of procurement which can help people work, keep their jobs also within their areas, but also provide further training opportunities. Now, during the summer, I met with many organisations throughout the west of Scotland, including a number of businesses, and I was struck by their commitment to the areas in which they are based and their determination to succeed despite the current tough economic conditions. And the hope and the optimism for the future was abundant. And they all actually said a very similar thing, that times are tough, but we have been in recessions before and we will come out stronger at the end. Now, this powerful message is one that I believe we cannot let go of. If we really want to see our communities across Scotland improve, we need to have a sharp focus on improving the economic opportunities for all. Now, my summer visits were interesting and fascinating at times, and also inspiring. And I do actually have only one disappointing comment to make. One issue of concern that was raised with me was by a public sector employee, was that regarding the community benefit clauses. Now, this individual informed me that a senior official within their particular public body, when questioned on the use of the clauses, apparently stated that they were illegal and they couldn't be used. Now, I've obviously got no proof of such an allegation, but I've got no reason to suggest that the employee is actually making this up. If the allegation is true, then that particular organisation has been done a disservice by that individual, as are those that are unemployed and looking for an opportunity in that area. Now, we can pass laws within the current limitations of this Parliament. However, if they're not been fully enacted on the ground, then there's a serious challenge ahead. Now, I would anticipate, however, that with this procurement reform bill, that this type of allegation can be consigned to the dustbin. The better regulation is one of those areas, Presiding Officer, that the business community want to see improved at every level. Now, I'm sure obviously there will be some businesses who would like to see less regulation to do business, but I know that certainly from my discussions this summer, that an improved regulatory regime is something that will be closely examined, and I'm sure that common ground can be found between the business community and this Parliament when the better regulation bill actually comes forward. Now, just a minute, John Park a moment ago in his speech was talking also about jobs and working to create further employment opportunities. Now, that was very much a welcome contribution to the debate, and I would hope certainly that John Park speaks to his party leader, because in her opening comments she seemed to kind of treat the better regulation bill with some disdain, but later on actually spoke about actually calling for jobs. Now, surely, if we're going to create jobs, we need businesses to actually create the jobs. So I certainly hope that John Park speaks to his party leader later on. Presiding Officer, today it was announced by Citizens Advice Scotland that a record number of people are turning to charities to feed themselves and their families. And I challenge every single MSP here today to stand up and be counted. Nobody in Scotland should be living with the indignity of resorting to charities to eat. The reasons for people contacting the food banks are varied, but it comes as no surprise that the UK Government's welfare reforms was one of them. If our citizens are struggling now, then what will the situation be like when many more UK cuts are inflicted in the coming years? In a country as rich as Scotland, nobody should have to live with this perpetual fear of wondering where the next meal is to come from. These are real people. Real lives are being consigned to daily misery and dread, and I, for one, want no part of living in a society that allows this to continue. Whilst we remain part of the union that allows the welfare state to adversely affect our citizens, this will continue. Whilst we remain part of the union that ensures the gap between the rich and the poor increases, this will continue. And, Presiding Officer, whilst we remain part of the union, the choice of helping those less well off will always be a distant second to the replacement of weapons of mass destruction on the Clyde. I believe, Presiding Officer, that with independence this Parliament will be better equipped to improve the lives of our citizens. Surely, as parliamentarians, we are here to make things better. Having the powers to tackle poverty in all its guises is something we need to tackle. Continuing with a union that is not fit for purpose is not the answer, and will not even begin to tackle the poverty that exists. Under the last Labour UK government, when Gordon Brown was the Prime Minister, the gap between the rich and the poor increased. Now, we know the current Tory Lib Dem coalition are out of touch, and no amount of deck chair shuffling today will actually improve this. However, we also know that the Labour government in power in Westminster the last time round couldn't be trusted to deliver for the less well-off. Only independents can deliver for Scotland and our people, and I warmly welcome today's announcement of the referendum bill and will campaign for a yes vote for a better Scotland. And, Presiding Officer, this programme, announced by the First Minister today, is ambitious for Scotland, and I welcome the positive vision for the people of Scotland. Thank you.
Thank you. Now call Patrick Harvey to be followed by Annabel Ewing.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I thank the Government for the advance copy of the statement today. The Government continues to claim its clear focus on the economic recovery as its central agenda, and I continue to say that there is a risk that agenda is simply one of repeating mistakes. I still don't get a clear sense of what recovery means to the Government beyond simply refloating a failed economic model that collapsed a few years ago and will fail us again if we try to repeat it. On an agenda like reindustrialisation or the renewables agenda, the Government is clearly making progress and is committed to that, but seems still to be quite comfortable with that industry remaining in the hands overwhelmingly of big business and passing up the opportunity to keep a share of it in community ownership or in public ownership. On democratic accountability, if economic recovery means anything, it has to come with it political recovery and the democratic accountability of our whole economy, not just of the public sector, ending the free market domination that we've seen. Economic recovery certainly means a low-carbon economy, but there seems sadly to be no recognition in the climate change section of the programme for government that the Government just failed on its first ever annual climate change target and needs to do much better if we're going to make up that lost ground in years to come. Now, some of this agenda... Yes, indeed.
Claudia Beamish.
Will the member agree with me that if the Scottish Government is to meet its targets on emissions in the future, that particularly in the areas of housing and transport, where very little, particularly in the second one, very little is new that is said in the programme, that this will have to be improved if we are to reach the targets by 2020?
Patrick Harvey.
Absolutely. I've been as vocal in criticising the current government's transport policies as I was in criticising its predecessor in the Labour-Liberal administration, pursuing much the same agenda. Some of these issues require more powers to address, but many of them can be worked on right now. The procurement bill has been mentioned, and we should, John Park is quite right, we should be challenging, not accepting the status quo of EU rules, but challenging them. Not just value for money in financial terms, but value for society is what we should be looking for from procurement. And there are economic justice arguments, including the living wage, including maximum wage ratios, including tax justice commitments. We should be placing barriers on companies that use tax loopholes and exploit tax havens and expect to win public sector contracts. We should be looking at localism so that public sector money, the taxpayers' money, stays circulating within a local economy. We should be looking at sustainability, and we should be looking at ethics so that a company's track record in dealing with regimes with abysmal human rights records is also something taken into account. Now, we may not be able to be absolute on these issues, but we must push at the very limits of EU procurement law if there's a slightest chance of getting momentum to change it. It remains to be seen if government has the will to do these things or not. As one counter-indication, I would be concerned if the Better Regulation Bill simply becomes a deregulation bill at the behest of big business looking to safeguard their own interests. On bus services, for example, one area where better regulation would very clearly mean stronger regulation, not weaker. And there are other examples as well. These and other questions are about the kind of Scotland that we want to build. Another example that's come up, which is a similar question, is the one on the same-sex marriage bill. I certainly add my voice to that of Joanne Lamont and Willie Rennie and others who said that this is a welcome bill, and I wish Nicola Sturgeon very well. I believe in her commitment to this bill, and I welcome that very strongly. Ruth Davidson said she looks forward to an open and respectful debate when we come to the scrutiny of that bill. Well, it'd be a nice change, wouldn't it? Sometimes we don't quite manage that tone of voice in our debates, and if we can on this issue, that would be positive. Whether one comes to this bill from the point of view of LGBT equality, of a respect for the equal rights, dignity and status of same-sex relationships as mixed sex, or whether you come to this bill from the point of view of religious freedom, I believe you must come to the same conclusion. Religious freedom doesn't exist in Scotland on this question. If we wish to extend religious freedom, we have to add our support for this bill. But we should go further as well. I don't understand why the Cabinet Secretary has said that there will be no support for mixed-sex civil partnerships. If same-sex couples are to have the right to choose to cohabit, or to have civil partnership, or to marry, why should mixed-sex couples not have that same choice? These are questions about the kind of country we want to build. And that brings me, of course, in my last minute to the constitutional future, perhaps the most important period of debate in modern Scottish political history. And I've said before, and I'll say it again, both sides need to bring a positive vision to this debate. If those of us seeking a yes vote in this referendum can articulate a compelling and transformational vision, we have a chance of convincing the so far unconvinced. But there must be room for substantive debate on tax, on welfare, on defence, on a written constitution, on human rights, robust parliamentary scrutiny, and yes, even an elected head of state. I have no interest in being told that these are matters we'll debate after the referendum. I've heard that too often. These issues must be debated during and with the referendum if we're going to have a chance of persuading people of that compelling and transformational vision of Scotland's future. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. I now call Annabel Ewing to be followed by Hugh Henry.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I'm very pleased indeed to have been called to speak in this important debate this afternoon on the Scottish Government's legislative programme for 2012-2013. As we have heard this afternoon, this is indeed an ambitious programme from an SNP government, which is, of course, ambitious for the people of our country. And the 15 bills announced today will make a real difference to improving people's lives. And it is to be hoped that all members will seek to work constructively together to ensure that these important measures can be properly scrutinised so that hopefully they can indeed pass into law. But before focusing my remarks this afternoon, Presiding Officer, on certain aspects of the legislative programme, it will come as no surprise, I would imagine, like to say a few words about the proposed referendum bill. And it is indeed a very historic day for Scotland that we are here in our Parliament in Edinburgh discussing the introduction of the referendum bill on the independence of our country. And what a privilege it is for me personally to be here today as a member of this Parliament, the Scottish Parliament, Presiding Officer, and what a testament, I believe, it is to the life's work of my mother, Winnie Ewing, and indeed my late father, Stuart Ewing, and all the many, many Scots who have tilled the soil over the long years that we have reached this important stage in Scotland's journey. For Presiding Officer, it is only with the normal powers of an independent country that Scotland can move forwards and can prosper. And indeed, it is only with the normal powers of an independent country that we can see real social justice in our country. And I have to say, Presiding Officer, that speaking of social justice, how can it possibly be that the Labour Party members here today prefer, it would appear, Tory rule to Home rule as far as our welfare system is concerned? How can they possibly conclude, and I quote from their campaign briefing, how can they possibly conclude that we are better together with the Tories, whose welfare cuts will hit the most vulnerable members of our society? Keir Hardie must be burling in his grave.
Jackie Bailey.
Can I thank the member for allowing me to intervene? Would she perhaps care to enlighten the Chamber that actually all she's doing in the Welfare Committee is passing on those Tory cuts to the people of Scotland?
Annabel Ewing.
Well, what can you say to that except that Keir Hardie must still be burling in his grave? But, Presiding Officer, looking to the next few years and to what we can do for families with the limited powers that we currently have, I would like to focus in the minutes remaining on the Children and Young People Bill. As has been mentioned this afternoon, this bill is intended to help to ensure that every single child in Scotland can achieve their full potential. This is an overarching objective of this SNP government, and it reflects the SNP government's ambition to make Scotland the best place in the world for a child to grow up in. And indeed, it appears that the focus is very much to be placed on early years and preventative spend. And of course, it has been widely recognised by the Christie Commission and indeed other reports, such as the Joining the Dots report from former Labour Minister Susan Deakin, that such early years preventative spend is pivotal in order to improve the lives of our citizens in the years to come, and indeed, of course, to get the best value for the public purse. The focus on early intervention and preventative spend is to be achieved, as we've heard, by a number of provisions, a key element being the proposed increase in the amount of free nursery education from 475 hours to minimum 600 hours for both 3- and 4-year-olds, as well as for looked-after 2-year-olds. And this indeed builds on the work that the SNP government had already embarked upon when it increased free nursery provision by 20% in the last parliamentary session. And this was widely welcomed since, of course, it benefited some 100,000 children. So it's clear that by enshrining the new enhanced package on free nursery care in legislation, we will be able to ensure, indeed, lasting change is delivered and that we can ensure that some flexibility is provided for in the way in which nursery care can be actually delivered. I am confident that the Scottish Government's plans for the best free nursery package in the UK will be seen as a good thing by families across Scotland, Presiding Officer, even if this afternoon some of the opposition members have displayed what I would term their usual negativity. I also understand that the bill will include provisions to ensure the enhancement of a child's rights and provide for a clear statutory framework for the organisation and delivery of services provided to children and young people, including, of course, vulnerable children. And in this respect, I think it is very important this afternoon to recognise the significant efforts over the years of all those involved in the provision of services to children and their sterling hard work. And indeed, as they will know, there have been many changes, and it is surely helpful for them to have these changes codified on a more consistent statutory basis and to have the child's interests put on a statutory footing at the very heart of that process. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, I look forward to future debates on that bill and indeed all the other bills as they come before the Parliament. But also, I would like to say in conclusion that we in the SNP are determined to improve the lives of all our citizens and to transform our country. This legislative programme, I believe, is another building block to that end, and I look forward, Presiding Officer, with enthusiasm and with vigour to the parliamentary year ahead. Thank you very much.
Many thanks. I now call Hugh Henry with a generous 6 minutes.
Okay, thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I associate myself with Stuart McMillan's comments and the passion that he articulated about not wanting to be part of a society where people are going hungry, where poverty is increasing? And, you know, it's right that Stuart McMillan places issues like that at the forefront. But, you know, he tried to suggest that somehow the problems were all with Westminster when it came to that. He tried to say that the issues of increasing poverty were evident under a Labour government at Westminster. And yet, when we look at that Labour government's record in tackling child poverty, we can actually see real success. And if we contrast that with what's happening, what has been happening in Scotland since 2007, where the administration with which Stuart McMillan wishes to associate himself, we actually see that child poverty is increasing. So, no, thank you. Let me make some progress. So, what we need to do, I think, is to get some kind of balance. And we also need to recognise that if we are willing to talk about tackling inequality, injustice and unfairness, then we need to question some of the things which have been done since 2007. Is it right that people like the First Minister and myself continue to benefit from, not just now, thanks, continue to benefit from the policies of this Scottish Government, while more children in communities that I and Stuart McMillan represents are driven into poverty? Is it right that the better off in society are continuing to flourish under this Scottish Government, while the poor and the dispossessed and the marginalised are suffering under this Government? So those questions do need to be addressed. No, thank you. John Mason said, and he articulated what many of the SNP speakers this afternoon have articulated, that for them, the issue that is most important is the Constitution. The Constitution is central to what we do, John Mason said. And I think that that's the difference between SNP speakers and those on the Labour benches, because the Constitution is not central to what we do. Tackling poverty and injustice is actually central to what we do. But also, it's interesting, you know, the flexibility of language. No, thank you. It's interesting, the flexibility of language and interpretation which we see articulated in this document. You know, for example, on page 72, paragraph 12, the Scottish Government has exceeded the agreed target in the number of teachers in Scotland's schools. Well, of course, the Scottish Government set a target in 2007 for the number of teachers in Scotland's schools. They said that they would match the numbers delivered by the previous Labour Liberal Democrat administration. But that, of course, became a mere expedient and was abandoned when it suited them. And now we have something like 3,000 fewer teachers in Scotland's schools than we had under the previous administration. So their targets are flexible and their words are very often hollow. We hear that the lowest level of teacher unemployment in the UK. The rate in 2012 is now lower than each of the last 3 years. Well, of course, each of the last 3 years was under the SNP administration, and now it's a boast that they are doing better than they did in the previous 3 years. The First Minister talks of Angela Constance and the dedicated post. But what about the unemployed women aged 18 to 24? Unemployed women in that age group up 30% from March 11 to March 12 in Scotland. And the level of 18 to 24-year-old women and job seekers allowance for 12 months or more up 335% since June 2011. That's the reality that the SNP government wishes to associate itself with. The Scottish Government talks about opportunities for all, yet it cuts college budgets. No, thank you. It boasts about modern apprenticeships. No, thank you. It boasts about modern apprenticeships, yet counts people already in work. And when it comes, no, thank you. No, thank you. When it comes to early years, then I would ask the question, why has it taken 5 years to bring forward the proposals to extend the hours? And as far as access to teachers is concerned, there is no mention in the consultation document about access to teachers. When are teachers going to be included in discussions on preschool education? There is no clear... You can answer that tomorrow in your contribution. Thank you. There is no clear role for the teacher in preschool education, and SNP ministers need to clarify that. And the First Minister in the document has said that it is right to concentrate on early years and it's right to take preventative action, and I agree with them. But really, if we do want to concentrate and take preventative action, we actually need to get down to vulnerable 2-year-olds. I recently spoke to some experienced social workers who said that very often, by the time children reach the age of 5, the damage has been done in vulnerable families. And we hear that this is the best package anywhere in these islands. Well, in England, they are gradually introducing 15 hours per week of free childcare for disadvantaged 2-year-olds by 2014. The first phase will reach 150,000 2-year-olds by 2013, 260,000 by 2014. And in Scotland, under a rough estimate from social work figures, just under 400 vulnerable 2-year-olds will benefit. So if we are serious about getting in early and tackling the problems, then we need to do something about vulnerable 2-year-olds. And we need to recognise that it's not just formal looked-after children. There are many vulnerable children in Scotland's towns and villages who are not formally looked after, but who are at risk.
The member's just finishing.
Time after time, we hear warm words, we hear glib statements, and we hear empty promises. But you have the opportunity, you have the power, you have the ability. So let's start doing something about vulnerable children.
And I now call Alex Neil, Cabinet Secretary. You have up to 8 minutes.
Very much indeed, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, very often when you get up to make a public speech, or other people do, they start off by saying that was a hard act to follow. I can honestly say that Hugh Henry's speech did not come into that category. Although, no doubt, he regarded that as a cheery and participative effort, I don't think the rest of us could do so. Although, to be fair, Presiding Officer, although we're only halfway through this debate, the other half is tomorrow, there have been some very good speeches from across the chamber. And if I may say so, I think the speech, for example, from John Park and the speech from Margaret McCulloch were very thoughtful. The speech from Annabel Ewing, from Chick Brodie, from Stuart Macmillan and others were equally very good indeed. But I have to say, Presiding Officer, one of the worst speeches was that made by Joanne Lamont, the leader of the Labour Party, because I've never heard a speech made by the leader of any party in this chamber that was as full of factual inaccuracies as her speech was. Indeed, Presiding Officer, it was so full of factual inaccuracies, it became very clear that the research for it had been done by Richard Baker. That in itself was depressing enough. But then, when we heard from Ruth Davison and Willie Rennie, he'd obviously done the research for their speeches as well. But, Presiding Officer, this is a very serious debate about the future of Scotland, and I think there are basically two underlying issues that we are debating this afternoon. The first one is, what is the best way to deal with the economic challenges our nation and other nations face? Do we want to follow the UK Tory Liberal example and go down the road of austerity, or do we want to follow Barack Obama and the US and go down the road of growth? Because the difference is, in the US, they have had quarter after quarter of growth in output, growth in jobs, reductions in unemployment. Now, they still face major challenges, but they haven't had the double-dip recession this year that we have had, with the possibility of a triple-dip recession. And the second underlying issue is where, I will in a minute, because I'm sure you'll make a better contribution than your leader. Not hard. But the second underlying issue is the one about the future of Scotland. Should we be continuing as a devolved Scotland with limited power, or as an independent country? And on that, I'll bring in Murdo Fraser, who I think privately is very close to independence.
Murdo Fraser.
No sooner does Mr Neil get to his feet, but the witch-finders arrive in the gallery. But just on Barack Obama, would Mr Neil not accept that Mr Obama does not have the Eurozone to contend with as his largest market? Perhaps if he did, he would find economic growth harder to come by.
Alec Neil.
Well, he does actually have the Eurozone to contend with, because the Eurozone area is one of the largest markets for the US. I'm sorry, Murdo, you're as factually incorrect as your leader in most of the contribution. But the two issues fundamentally are linked, Presiding Officer, because what we want as a government and as a nation is the ability for us to make the choice. Because if this Parliament, if this government, or indeed a government led by Ms Lamont, were in power, I'm absolutely sure they would not want to follow the austerity policies of the UK Tory and Liberal government. We would want to follow the policy of growth and investment. And we would do that for very good reason. You know, I heard a speech, I didn't hear it, I read about a speech during the summer by Gordon Brown, defending the Union, attacking even fiscal autonomy, let alone independence. And he referred to the United Kingdom as being one of the most successful unions in history. What is successful throughout the United Kingdom, never mind just in Scotland? What is successful about double-dip recession? What is successful about a high level of unemployment? What is successful about dire levels of poverty and child poverty? And what is successful about spending so many billions in nuclear weapons when so many of our own people need that money to be spent on public services and basic human conditions? The fact of life is, presiding officer, even with the very limited powers we have, we have demonstrated by making the maximum use of those powers that we have made a difference to the Scottish economy. That is why the level of employment in Scotland is higher than south of the border. It is why generally our unemployment is lower than south of the border, although in our view still too high. It's why, despite the 30% real cut in the capital budget from London, over the next 3 or 4 years, through our innovative approach with the Scottish Futures Trust, with the NPD programme, with the reallocation of resources from the current budget to the capital budget, that is why, despite all of that, we either directly or indirectly will be leveraging a total of nearly £12 billion in capital investment in Scotland over the next 3 or 4 years. Had it been left only to the previous administration, or indeed to London with no Scottish Parliament, the level of investment in capital would have been around £2.5 billion a year over the next 3 years, a substantially reduced figure from the one we've got. And let me say to Ruth Davison, who clearly doesn't know anything about housing or housing expenditure, we have used our resources in housing to maximise investment. The figure that matters is the total investment in housing. So, under the previous administration, for every £7 they put in, they get £3 from elsewhere. We have reversed that. For every £3 we put in, we get £7 from elsewhere, either the private sector or through local authorities or other organisations. And that is the difference. Not only do we make sure we're building the houses, a record number of houses, we are also making sure that we use the money available to us wisely. And that is why this year, next year and every year in this Parliament, we will complete more than 6,000 social houses in Scotland, presiding officer. A record that's far, far better than the average of under 5,000 by the previous administration. And what I would say is this, presiding officer, particularly to the Labour Party. Hugh Henry said the Constitution doesn't matter. Why were they devolutionists then, if the Constitution didn't matter? Donald Dewar used to argue for a Parliament so there could be Scottish solutions to Scottish problems in the health service, in education, in transport, in social work. Well, if it applies to all those areas of policy, sure, it's even more important to have Scottish solutions to Scottish problems in terms of the economy, taxation, welfare and all the range of reserved responsibilities at Westminster. The reality is, presiding officer, if the people of Scotland vote yes, they face a prosperous future. If they vote no and you're under 25, you'll lose your housing benefit. If you vote no, child poverty will go through the roof. The loud and clear message is if you want Scotland to have a decent future and our people and our children to be able to live and work in their own country. Yes is the only way to vote in 2014.
This debate on the Scottish Government's programme will continue tomorrow afternoon, but it is now time to move on to the next item of business. And the next item of business is consideration of Business Motion 3926 in the name of Bruce Crawford on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau, setting out an extension to a Stage 1 deadline. I would ask any member who wishes to speak against the motion to press the request to speak button now. And I call on Bruce Crawford to move motion number 3926.
Formally moved.
Thank you very much. No member has asked to speak against the motion. Therefore, I will now put the question to the Chamber. The question is that motion number 3926 in the name of Bruce Crawford be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed, and the motion is therefore agreed to. The next item of business is consideration of 5 Parliamentary Bureau motions, and I would ask Bruce Crawford to move motion number 3927 on committee membership, motion number 3928 on substitution on a committee, motion number 3929 on the designation of lead committee, motion number 3930 on the office of the clerk, and motion number 3931 on parliamentary recess dates. Mr Crawford.
Moved.
Thank you. The question on these motions will be put at decision time. However, before I come to decision time, earlier today, Neil Findlay, MSP, raised a point of order regarding the alleged use of a social networking site by the First Minister during the debate on the Scottish Government's programme. The presiding officer wrote to all MSPs in March, reminding them of the use of electronic media in the Chamber, and the letter stated that the presiding officer did not consider that the use of electronic devices for purposes such as social networking sites was compatible with the requirements of conduct in the Chamber. Having investigated this particular matter, I can now inform the Chamber that the First Minister has confirmed that the relevant tweets were sent on behalf of the First Minister from this account. Order. 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 Details of how the account is managed can be found on the First Minister's networking site. We are now moving on to Mr Henry. We are now moving on to decision time. Is that it? Order, please. We are now moving on to decision time, and there are 5 questions to be. Sandra White.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. During the exchange with Neil Findlay regarding the First Minister and the tweeting or whatever it may be, it was also asked how Neil Findlay, MSP, could find this out. While the First Minister was not using the device in the Chamber, Neil Findlay, MSP, was. So is there not an order against him?
Not a point of order. I'm moving on to decision time, and there are 5 questions to be put as a result of today's business. The first question is that motion number 3927 in the name of Bruce Crawford on committee membership be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to. The second question is that motion 3928 in the name of Bruce Crawford on substitution on a committee be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. The third question is that motion number 3929 in the name of Bruce Crawford on designation of a lead committee be agreed to. Are we all agreed? That is agreed. The fourth question is that motion number 3930 in the name of Bruce Crawford on office of the clerk be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. That is agreed. And the next question is that motion number 3931 in the name of Bruce Crawford on parliamentary recess dates be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. That motion is therefore agreed to. And that concludes decision time, and we will now move on to the next item of business, which is members' business. Can I ask members who are leaving the chamber to do so quietly, and I'll give a short interval for members to change seats.